The night Duke Adrian Whitemore realized he had destroyed the only thing worth saving, he stood alone in the grand hall of Blackthorn Castle, watching snow fall through windows that had never seemed so empty before. 7 years of marriage reduced to a single sheet of paper on his desk. 7 years of silence finally broken by the sound of her footsteps disappearing down the corridor. And in that crystallizing moment of loss, the most powerful man in the Northern Territories understood what it meant to be utterly powerless. But this story does not begin with endings. It begins 3 months earlier, when the first crack appeared in a marriage built on duty and slowly suffocating under the weight of everything left unsaid. Stay with me through the winter that changed 2 lives forever, because some truths only reveal themselves when everything has already fallen apart. The first snowfall of the season came early that year, covering Blackthorn Castle in a silence that felt less like peace and more like holding your breath underwater. Lady Seraphina Vale stood at the window of her chambers, watching the courtyard below, where stable hands rushed to secure the horses before the storm arrived in full force. Her reflection in the glass looked like a stranger wearing her face. Hollow eyes. Practiced smile. The kind of emptiness that comes from years of being looked through rather than looked at. She had not slept beside her husband in 4 months. Not that Adrian had noticed, or if he had, he certainly had not mentioned it. The knock on her door came precisely at 7, as it always did. Her lady's maid entered with the evening gown already selected by the household steward, according to the guest list for tonight's banquet. Dark blue velvet with silver embroidery, conservative neckline. Nothing that would draw attention because attention was something the Duchess of Blackthorn was never supposed to seek. Seraphina allowed herself to be dressed like a doll prepared for display, her mind somewhere far beyond these stone walls. The maid worked in silence, having learned years ago that the Duchess preferred not to fill empty air with empty conversation. Downstairs in his study, Adrian Whitemore reviewed the evening seating arrangements with the cold efficiency he applied to everything in his life. Lord Ashford to his right because the grain shipment contracts needed to be finalized. Magistrate Thorne across from him because the border disputes required a neutral arbiter. His wife at the far end of the table because that was where wives traditionally sat, and Adrian Whitemore was nothing if not traditional. He barely glanced up when his secretary mentioned that the Duchess had requested permission to visit her family estate next month. Denied, Adrian said, signing another document without breaking rhythm. The winter season requires her presence here for all social obligations. His secretary hesitated, then cleared his throat. Your Grace, Lady Vale has not seen her sister in nearly 2 years. Adrian's pen stopped moving. He looked up with eyes that had been described by poets as storm gray and by his enemies as colorless. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The Duchess understood the responsibilities of her position when she married into this family. If her sister wishes to visit, she is welcome to make the journey here. The secretary knew better than to argue. He bowed and left Adrian alone with his paperwork and his certainty that he had made the correct decision. Duty came before sentiment, structure before chaos. These were the principles that had built the Whitemore legacy over 5 generations, and Adrian would not be the Duke who let them crumble for something as trivial as familial nostalgia. What he did not know, what he could not have known because he had stopped truly looking at his wife somewhere around year 3, was that this small denial would be the stone that finally broke through ice that had been freezing over for far too long. Sick. The banquet hall blazed with candlelight that did nothing to warm the cavernous space. 70 guests arranged according to rank and political usefulness. Conversation flowed like wine, carefully measured and just as intoxicating. At the head of the table, Adrian discussed tax reforms with Lord Ashford while simultaneously tracking 3 other conversations happening around him. This was his domain, strategy and power dynamics playing out across silver plates and crystal glasses. At the far end, Seraphina smiled at Lady Pemberton's story about her grandson's first hunting trip. She laughed at the appropriate moments, nodded with practiced interest. Inside her chest, something that used to feel like hope had finally finished dying. She watched her husband command the room with the same cold brilliance that had first attracted her 7 years ago when she was young enough to mistake intensity for passion. Back then, she had believed that beneath his austere exterior lived a man who simply needed the right woman to teach him warmth. She had been so certain that love could bloom in frozen ground if you watered it with enough patience. 7 years later, she understood that some soil is just stone. Adrian caught her eye across the expanse of the table. For a fraction of a second, their gazes held. She saw him register her presence the way someone might notice a familiar painting on the wall, acknowledged but not truly seen. Then his attention shifted back to Lord Ashford, and the moment dissolved like it had never existed at all. Serafina excused herself before dessert was served, claiming a headache that no one questioned because no one particularly cared. She walked through corridors lined with portraits of Whitemoor ancestors, all of them watching her with Adrian's same gray eyes and unchanging expressions. 7 years of her life hung on these walls, and she could not point to a single moment that belonged entirely to her. She did not go back to her chambers. Instead, she found herself in the castle's library, a vast room that smelled of leather and old paper and decisions made by dead men. This had been her refuge during the early years when she still believed reading might help her understand the man she had married. She had consumed every book on Northern history, on the Whitemoor family legacy, on the political philosophy that shaped Adrian's worldview. As if knowledge could be a bridge across the silence between them. It had not worked. Understanding someone does not make them love you back. Serafina pulled a book from the shelf without reading its title. She sat in the window seat overlooking the gardens where snow was beginning to accumulate on bare branches. The book remained closed in her lap while she stared into the darkness and tried to remember the last time Adrian had touched her without political motivation. The last time he had asked her a question that was not purely functional. The last time he had looked at her like she was a person instead of a position. She could not recall. That was the most devastating part. The loneliness had become so normalized that she could no longer identify the exact moment when their marriage had transformed from disappointing to unbearable. Behind her, the library door opened. She did not turn around, assuming it was a servant come to stoke the fire. But the footsteps were wrong, too measured, too heavy. "You left before the toast," Adrian said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast room. Serafina closed her eyes briefly before turning to face him. Her husband stood framed in the doorway like a portrait of aristocratic disapproval, still in his formal dinner attire, not a thread out of place, not a hint of emotion breaking through that carefully maintained exterior. "I was not feeling well." Lady Pemberton seemed disappointed. "She specifically requested your presence at her table." "Then I apologize for the inconvenience," Serafina said, her voice perfectly neutral because emotion was ammunition and she had learned not to give him any. Adrian stepped further into the library but maintained the distance he always kept between them, as if proximity might be contagious. His eyes swept over her with the same analytical assessment he applied to everything, cataloging, categorizing, finding her somehow inadequate without being able to articulate exactly how. "This behavior reflects poorly on our household," he said. "When you accept a position at these events, you're expected to fulfill that obligation." Serafina felt something sharp twist behind her ribs. 7 years of swallowing responses. 7 years of bending herself into shapes that fit his expectations. 7 years of waiting for him to see her as something more than a household obligation. The words came out before she could stop them. "I am not a position, Adrian. I am your wife." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear snow hitting the windows. Adrian stared at her like she had spoken a foreign language. His brow furrowed slightly, the only indication that her statement had registered at all. "I am aware of that," he said finally, his tone suggesting he was addressing a child who had stated something obvious. "That is precisely why your conduct matters. You represent this family." "No," Serafina said, standing up from the window seat, the closed book sliding from her lap to the floor. "I represent myself. Or at least I used to before I married you and became a decoration you wheel out for banquets and political theater." Adrian's jaw tightened. "You are being emotional." "Yes. Yes, I am being emotional, because I'm a human being with emotions, not a chess piece you move around your board." She could see him retreat further behind those impenetrable walls, his face settling into the mask of cold authority that he wielded like armor. This was what he did when confronted with anything that threatened his carefully controlled world. He became more duke and less man until there was nothing left to argue with except stone. "I do not understand what has prompted this outburst," he said, each word precisely placed. "If you have concerns about household management, we can address them through the proper channels." Serafina laughed, and the sound was so bitter it surprised even her. "Household management. That is what you think this is about. What else would it be about? Us, Adrian. This is about us. About the fact that we have been married 7 years and you still look at me like I am a stranger you are forced to tolerate. I have never been anything but respectful toward you. Respectful, she repeated, tasting the word like poison. You have been respectful, distant, polite. Every single thing except present. Do you even remember the last conversation we had that was not about schedules or social obligations? Adrian's hands clasped behind his back, his default stance when he felt control slipping. We are adults with responsibilities. I do not have time for frivolous conversation. Wanting to know your wife is not frivolous. I know everything necessary about you. Do you? She took a step toward him, watching him automatically step back to maintain the distance. Tell me then. What is my favorite season? What do I do when I cannot sleep? What was I like before I became the Duchess of Blackthorn and forgot how to be Seraphina? Adrian's expression flickered, the first genuine emotion she had seen from him in months. But it was not understanding or remorse. It was irritation at being challenged, at having his authority questioned in any capacity. This conversation is pointless, he said, turning toward the door. You are clearly overtired. We will discuss this when you are being rational. And just like that, he dismissed her, the same way he dismissed anything that did not fit neatly into his worldview. Seraphina watched him walk away, his shoulders rigid with the certainty that he was right, and she was simply being difficult. The library door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like an ending. Seraphina stood alone among 10,000 books, written by people who had understood human connection better than her husband ever would. She looked down at the volume that had fallen to the floor. Its pages had splayed open to a random passage, and though she could not read it in the dim light, she did not need to. She had memorized enough words from enough books to know that none of them contained the answer she had been searching for all these years. You cannot learn to be loved by someone who has decided you are not worth the effort. Tsheg. 3 weeks passed in the careful choreography that had defined their marriage from the beginning. Adrian managed his duchy with ruthless efficiency. Seraphina attended every required event with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. They moved through Blackthorn Castle like ghosts haunting separate wings of the same mausoleum. But something had shifted after that night in the library. Seraphina stopped pretending that politeness was the same as peace. She began to notice all the small ways she had made herself smaller to fit into Adrian's world, the interests she had abandoned because he considered them trivial, the friendships that had withered because he found her companions unsuitable, the pieces of herself she had sacrificed on the altar of being the perfect Duchess. She started keeping a journal, writing late at night when the castle fell silent, and she could hear her own thoughts above the weight of expectations. The pages filled with observations that had been accumulating for 7 years, finally given voice. Today, Adrian corrected the way I addressed the magistrate's wife. He did it in front of 6 other people, his tone suggesting I was a student who had failed to complete an assignment properly. I smiled and thanked him for the guidance. Later, alone, I wept in a way I have not wept since the first year. Not from sadness anymore, from rage. At him for his cruelty. At myself for accepting it. I realized today that I no longer remember the sound of my own laughter. The real kind. The kind that comes from joy instead of obligation. I do not know when I lost it. Somewhere between years 3 and 5, I think. Around the time I stopped asking Adrian to come to bed. Around the time I understood he preferred his study to my company. Lady Pemberton asked me today if everything was well. I told her everything was wonderful. I have become an extraordinary liar, even to myself. The journal became her confession and her rebellion. The one place where she did not have to be the Duchess, or the wife, or the perfectly composed woman who never complained about the slow death of being married to a man who had no interest in knowing her. Adrian, for his part, seemed oblivious to the change. Or perhaps he simply chose not to see it, which was worse. He continued to organize their lives with methodical precision, allocating time for social obligations and political strategy while allocating nothing for the woman who slept in chambers growing colder by the day. In his mind, the marriage was functioning exactly as it should. She performed her duties. He performed his. What more could reasonably be expected from an arrangement that had always been more political alliance than romantic union? He did not notice that she no longer asked him questions about his day, did not register that she stopped waiting for him to join her for dinner, taking her meals alone in her sitting room instead. did not see the way her eyes had stopped seeking him out across crowded rooms, no longer searching for connection that would never come. What he did notice, because it affected him directly, was when Serafina stopped attending his mother's weekly luncheons at the Dowager Duchess's residence. His mother, Duchess Isolde Whitemore, had never approved of the marriage. She had wanted Adrian to wed Lady Cordelia Ashford, whose family controlled the western ports and could have expanded Whitemore influence significantly. Instead, Adrian had chosen Serafina Vale, the second daughter of a minor noble family with moderate land holdings and very little political leverage. Duchess Isolde had spent 7 years making her disappointment known through carefully placed criticisms and social maneuvers designed to remind Serafina of her inferior status. The weekly luncheons were performances of passive aggression disguised as family obligation, and Serafina had endured them with gritted teeth because Adrian expected her to maintain family harmony. Now she simply stopped going. Adrian's secretary delivered the message while the Duke reviewed crop rotation reports. "Your mother requests your presence at her residence this afternoon. The Duchess apparently sent her regrets for today's luncheon." Again. Adrian looked up from his paperwork. Again. "This is the 3rd week, Your Grace." Adrian set down his pen with deliberate slowness. "Did my wife provide a reason?" "She claimed a prior commitment." The secretary shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Your mother was quite insistent that you address the situation." "Of course she was. Duchess Isolde treated every perceived slight as a declaration of war, and Serafina's absence would be interpreted as the highest form of disrespect." Adrian felt irritation prickle along his spine, not at his mother, but at his wife for creating this unnecessary complication. He found Serafina in the East Garden, despite the cold, wrapped in a thick cloak and sketching the bare trees with charcoal on paper. It was an activity he had not seen her do in years. He had forgotten she enjoyed drawing, or perhaps he had never known in the first place. "My mother is upset," he said without preamble. Serafina did not look up from her sketch. "I see. You have missed 3 consecutive luncheons." "Yes. That is unacceptable behavior." Now she did look up, her eyes meeting his with unsettling directness. "Unacceptable to whom?" "To my mother. To me. To anyone who understands basic family obligation." Serafina returned her attention to her drawing, adding shadow to the trunk of a tree with careful strokes. "I am no longer interested in subjecting myself to your mother's company. That is not your decision to make." "Actually," she said, her voice calm in a way that felt dangerous, "it is exactly my decision to make. I am not required to spend my time with people who treat me with contempt. My mother has always been perfectly civil to you." Serafina laughed, short and sharp. "Your mother has spent 7 years making it abundantly clear that I am an inadequate replacement for Lady Cordelia. She insults my family, criticizes my every action, and undermines me at every opportunity. And you have never once defended me because that would require you to see me as something other than a subordinate who should simply accept her place." Adrian felt his control slipping, the way it always did when Serafina stopped behaving according to script. "You are being oversensitive, and you are being deliberately blind. I will not have you disrespecting my mother." "Then we are at an impasse," Serafina said, setting down her charcoal and meeting his gaze with an expression he could not quite read, "because I will not continue pretending that her cruelty is civility just to make your life more convenient. This is not about convenience, this is about family duty." "No, Adrian, this is about the fact that you care more about your mother's feelings than your wife's dignity. But I suppose I should have realized that years ago." She stood, gathering her sketching materials with calm precision. Adrian watched her, feeling something unfamiliar twist in his chest. It felt almost like uncertainty, which was absurd because he was absolutely certain he was right. "You will attend next week's luncheon," he said, his voice hardening into command. "I will not tolerate this rebellion." Serafina paused, looking at him with something that might have been pity. "You can command many things, Adrian, but you cannot command me to willingly subject myself to abuse. I am done with your mother's luncheons. If that is rebellion, then consider me a revolutionary." She walked past him toward the castle, leaving him standing alone in the frozen garden with the growing realization that he had no idea how to handle a wife who had stopped being compliant. That night, Adrian sought his mother's counsel at her residence. a perfectly appointed townhouse in the city that Duchess Isolde had occupied since her husband's death 10 years prior. She received him in her drawing room, surrounded by the trappings of old wealth and older grudges. "Your wife grows bold," Isolde said, pouring tea with movements honed by decades of aristocratic performance. "I warned you she lacked proper breeding." Adrian accepted the teacup with automatic politeness. "Serafina is simply going through a difficult phase. She will return to reason." "Will she?" Isolde's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. Or perhaps she finally understands that you never truly wanted her in the first place. "That is absurd. I married her of my own choice." "You married her because you were young and believed sentiment should factor into strategic decisions." Isolde took a delicate sip of tea. Lady Cordelia would never have shown such disrespect. She understood duty. Adrian felt defensive in a way he could not fully articulate. "Serafina understands duty perfectly well. She has performed her role admirably for 7 years. Has she given you an heir?" The question landed like a blade between ribs. No. They had not. In the early years there had been attempts, awkward and obligatory, and ultimately fruitless. After the 3rd year, those attempts had ceased altogether. Adrian had told himself it was simply a matter of poor timing, but sitting in his mother's drawing room, he was forced to confront the possibility that Serafina had stopped trying for reasons that had nothing to do with biology. "That is a private matter," he said stiffly. "Nothing is private for a duke without a successor," Isolde said, her voice sharp. "The council has already begun questioning your marriage's viability. Lord Ashford mentioned it to me just last week. They wonder if perhaps the Vale bloodline is simply too weak. Serafina's bloodline is perfectly adequate. Then why has she failed in the one duty every duchess must fulfill?" Adrian set down his teacup with more force than intended. "This conversation is inappropriate. Is it? Or is it simply uncomfortable?" Isolde leaned forward, her eyes glittering with the kind of certainty Adrian had always associated with wisdom, but was beginning to recognize as something darker. "You have been too lenient with her, Adrian, too permissive. A wife requires firm guidance, structure. If you do not assert your authority now, she will continue to spiral into this unseemly independence. What would you have me do? Lock her in her chambers? If necessary." Isolde's tone suggested she was not entirely joking. "Our family has not maintained power for 5 generations by allowing sentiment to undermine tradition. Your father understood that. You would do well to remember his example." Adrian thought of his father, the previous Duke Whitemore, a man who had treated his wife with the same cold efficiency he applied to managing his estates. Adrian's memories of his parents' marriage were crystalline in their emptiness, 2 people occupying the same space while living entirely separate lives. His mother had seemed content with that arrangement, or at least she had never complained. Until this moment, it had never occurred to Adrian that perhaps his mother's contentment had been a performance just as elaborate as any court ritual. He left his mother's residence with her words circling his mind like carrion birds. That night, he found himself standing outside Serafina's chambers, something he had not done in months. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What would he even say? That his mother thought he was being too lenient? That the council questioned their marriage? That he suddenly felt the need to assert authority he had always assumed he possessed? His hand lowered. He turned away, returning to his own chambers and telling himself that morning would be soon enough to address the situation. He would speak with Serafina rationally, explain the political necessities. She would understand. She had always understood. Except she had not always understood. That was the lie he had been telling himself for 7 years. She had simply stopped arguing. He fell asleep with that realization lodged uncomfortably in his chest, like a stone he could not dislodge. What Adrian did not know, what he could not have known, because he had long since stopped paying attention to the administrative details he considered beneath his concern, was that Serafina had spent the past month quietly consulting with the kingdom's most prominent divorce attorney. The man's name was Elias Thorne, and he specialized in cases involving noble families where the political implications were as complex as the emotional devastation. He had handled 7 high-profile separations in the past decade, each one executed with surgical precision to minimize scandal while protecting his client's interests. Serafina met with him in his offices in the capital, a 3-hour carriage ride from Blackthorn Castle that she undertook under the guise of visiting old friends. She sat across from his desk in a modest gray dress, her hands folded in her lap with the composure she had perfected over years of diplomatic performance. Mr. Thorne reviewed the documents she had provided: marriage contract, financial records, correspondence that documented the systematic isolation she had endured. He was a thin man with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and after 30 minutes of careful examination, he looked up at her with an expression of professional sympathy. "The law is not kind to wives seeking divorce, Lady Whitemore, especially wives married to powerful men." "I am aware," Serafina said quietly. "Your husband would need to be proven unfit in some demonstrable way. Adultery, abuse, abandonment. From what you have told me and what these documents show, he has committed none of these offenses legally speaking. Emotional abandonment is not grounds for divorce? Unfortunately, no. The law recognizes physical separation or financial neglect, but not the slow death of being married to someone who treats you as furniture." Serafina closed her eyes briefly. "Then what are my options?" "You could wait," Thorne said carefully. 7 years without an heir begins to create legal vulnerability for him. If you remain childless for another 3 years, the council can petition to annul the marriage on grounds of incompatibility. 10 years, Serafina said. "You are suggesting I endure 3 more years." "Or," Thorne continued, "you could force his hand." "How?" "Make the marriage untenable for him. Create a situation where divorce becomes his preference rather than yours. It is ruthless, but effective." Serafina looked at the attorney with new eyes. "You have done this before." 3 times. Thorne smiled thinly. Powerful men rarely grant freedom willingly, but they will do almost anything to escape public embarrassment. She listened as Thorne outlined the strategy: a careful campaign of social withdrawal, public independence, and strategic alliance building that would paint her as sympathetic and Adrian as tyrannical. It would take months. It would require her to weaponize every social connection she had cultivated during 7 years of being the perfect Duchess. It would transform their private misery into public spectacle. And at the end, she would either have her freedom or have destroyed what remained of their marriage so thoroughly that even Adrian would agree to let her go. "How long?" she asked. 6 months, Thorne said. "Perhaps less if he is as proud as you say. Men like the Duke cannot tolerate being seen as failures, especially in matters of family. When it becomes clear that staying married to you damages his reputation more than divorce would, he will sign whatever papers you put in front of him." Serafina thought of 7 years condensed into 6 months of deliberate warfare. She thought of the woman she had been when she first arrived at Blackthorn Castle, full of hope and naive enough to believe that patience was the same as love. She thought of the woman she had become, hollow and tired, and so desperately lonely that even solitude felt like an improvement. "Prepare the documents," she said. Thorne nodded, pulling fresh paper from his desk drawer. "I will need a retainer." She placed a small leather purse on his desk, her personal jewelry, sold to a discreet merchant in the capital. The proceeds were modest but sufficient. "One more thing," Thorne said as she prepared to leave. "Once we begin this process, there is no going back gracefully. Your husband will feel betrayed. He will likely retaliate." "Let him," Serafina said, and for the first time in years she felt something like power stirring in her chest. "I am done being afraid of his disapproval." She returned to Blackthorn Castle as twilight fell, snow beginning to accumulate on the roads. The carriage passed through the gates that had felt like prison bars for so long. Inside, Adrian was likely in his study, oblivious to the fact that his wife had just set in motion the destruction of everything he took for granted. Serafina went to her chambers and pulled out her journal. She wrote 4 words before closing it again. "The countdown begins." The first move in Thorne's strategy was subtle. Serafina began accepting social invitations without consulting Adrian first: luncheons with prominent ladies of the court, attendance at literary salons, participation in charitable organizations that had previously been deemed inappropriate for a duchess of her standing. Adrian noticed when his secretary informed him that the Duchess had committed them to Lady Pemberton's winter charity gala without his approval. "We do not attend Pemberton events," Adrian said, barely glancing up from his correspondence. "Their political leanings are too progressive." His secretary cleared his throat nervously. "The Duchess has already sent confirmation, Your Grace. Apparently she is joining Lady Pemberton's Committee for Orphanage Reform." "What committee?" It was formed last month. Several prominent families are involved. The Duchess seems quite passionate about the cause. Adrian set down his pen slowly. Passionate. Since when had Serafina been passionate about anything beyond her obligatory duties? He dismissed the secretary and summoned his wife to his study immediately. She arrived without hurrying, which was itself unusual. The old Serafina would have rushed to answer his summons. This version walked through his door with calm deliberation, taking a seat without being offered one. "I did not approve the Pemberton Gala attendance," Adrian said. "I did not require your approval." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Adrian felt his jaw tighten. "Everything you do reflects on this household. Therefore, everything requires my approval." "No," Serafina said simply. "It does not." He stared at her, genuinely shocked. In 7 years, she had never directly contradicted him. Disagreed privately, yes, but never with this flat certainty that suggested she no longer cared about the consequences. "I am rescinding the confirmation," he said. "You cannot rescind what I have committed to personally. Then you will send your regrets and cite a prior obligation." "I will not." Serafina stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that did not tremble. "I am attending the Pemberton Gala. I am joining the Orphanage Reform Committee. I am resuming my friendship with Lady Charlotte Dubois, whom you banned from this house 5 years ago for no reason beyond your own arbitrary preference. And I am doing all of this without your permission because I am not your subordinate, Adrian. I am your wife." "There is a difference." She walked toward the door while Adrian sat frozen in his chair, his carefully constructed worldview cracking like ice under sudden weight. "If you continue this behavior," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "there will be consequences." Serafina paused at the door, looking back at him with eyes that held no fear. Only exhaustion. "What consequences, Adrian? Will you lock me in my chambers? Forbid me from attending events? Send me to your mother for re-education? You have already made my life in this castle unbearable. What exactly do you think you can threaten me with that would be worse than the prison I have been living in for 7 years? The door closed behind her with devastating quietness. Adrian sat alone in his study, staring at the space where his wife had been, feeling something he had not experienced since he was a child lost in the woods during a hunting trip. The cold, creeping certainty that he had no idea where he was or how to find his way back. Outside his window, snow continued to fall on Blackthorn Castle, covering everything in white that would soon turn gray. And in her chambers, Serafina sat at her writing desk and composed a letter to Elias Thorne. He is angry, but not yet broken. We proceed to phase 2. The letter to Elias Thorne had been sent 3 days ago, and Serafina had received his reply that morning tucked inside a book delivery from a capital bookseller. Their agreed method of discreet communication. His instructions were clear. Phase 2 required visibility. She needed to be seen thriving outside the castle walls while Adrian remained trapped inside his own rigidity. She stood now in the drawing room of Lady Charlotte Dubois, a woman Adrian had banned from Blackthorn Castle 5 years prior for the crime of encouraging Serafina to speak her mind at a political dinner. Charlotte was 10 years older, widowed young, and had spent the past decade building a reputation as a patron of arts and progressive causes that made conservative nobles uncomfortable, which was precisely why Serafina had chosen to resurrect their friendship now. "You look different," Charlotte said, pouring tea with the ease of someone who had stopped caring about Perfect Hostess performance years ago. Sharper somehow. "I feel different," Serafina admitted. She accepted the teacup and noticed her hands were steady. That was new, or perhaps old. She could not remember the last time she had held something without the slight tremor that came from constant vigilance. Charlotte studied her with eyes that missed nothing. "Does the Duke know you are here?" "He knows I left the castle. I doubt he cares enough to track my specific location." "Oh, he cares," Charlotte said, settling into her chair with a slight smile. Men like Adrian Whitemore care very much about control. They simply convince themselves that control is the same as indifference. When you stop being controllable, you will discover just how much he has been paying attention all along. The words settled over Serafina like prophecy. She thought of Adrian in his study, likely reviewing agricultural reports or trade agreements, telling himself that his wife's sudden independence was a temporary aberration that would correct itself through sheer force of his disapproval. "He will not see it coming," Serafina said quietly. "None of them ever do," Charlotte replied. "That is their fatal weakness. They mistake compliance for contentment. By the time they realize the difference, it is too late. They spent the afternoon discussing the Orphanage Reform Committee, but more importantly, they discussed strategy. Charlotte knew every prominent family in the kingdom and exactly which alliances would infuriate Adrian most. She suggested Serafina attend Magistrate Thorne's lecture series on legal reform, knowing that Adrian had publicly opposed the magistrate's progressive positions for years. She recommended accepting Lady Pemberton's invitation to speak at the Women's Education Symposium, an event that Adrian considered dangerously radical. Visibility, Charlotte said, refilling their teacups. That is your weapon now. Every public appearance you make without him sends a message. The dutiful Duchess is becoming her own woman. Society will notice, and more importantly, they will judge him for it. Let them judge, Serafina said, and meant it. She returned to Blackthorn Castle as evening shadows stretched across the courtyard. The castle looked different now, less like a prison and more like a place she was preparing to leave. The distinction mattered. Prisoners dreamed of escape. She was planning an exit. Adrian was waiting for her in the entrance hall, which was unusual enough to make her pause. He rarely positioned himself anywhere that suggested he had been watching for her return. His expression was carved from stone, but his eyes held something she had not seen before. Not quite anger, not quite concern. Something that lived in the space between both. "Where have you been?" he said. Not asked. Said. "Visiting Lady Charlotte. I specifically forbade that friendship years ago." "Yes," Serafina said, removing her gloves with deliberate slowness. "You did. I am resuming it anyway." She moved toward the stairs, but Adrian stepped into her path. It was the closest they had been in months, and she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands flexed at his sides like he was physically restraining himself from some action he could not name. "You are deliberately defying me. I am deliberately living my own life. Those are the same thing, only in your mind, Adrian. To everyone else, they are completely different." He searched her face with an intensity that would have thrilled her 7 years ago. Now it just made her tired. This was not the attention she had craved. This was a man realizing his possession was slipping away and finally bothering to look at what he was losing. "My mother wants to speak with you," he said, changing tactics. "Then your mother can write me a letter. This is not a request." "Everything is a request now, Adrian. You simply have not adjusted to that reality yet." She moved around him and up the stairs, feeling his stare burning into her back. Let him stare. Let him wonder. Let him feel even a fraction of the uncertainty she had lived with for 7 years. In her chambers, she found a note slipped under her door. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Duchess Isolde's sharp, controlled script that looked like calligraphy pretending to be casual correspondence. "Your behavior brings shame to this family. If you do not correct course immediately, I will ensure the council hears of your unfitness. Do not test me, girl. You are replaceable." Serafina read it twice, then walked to her fireplace and fed it to the flames. She watched the paper curl and blacken, Isolde's threats dissolving into ash. 7 years ago, this note would have terrified her. Now it just confirmed that her strategy was working. They only threatened what they feared losing. She pulled out her journal and wrote in the margins of the last entry. "The Dowager is frightened. Adrian is confused. I am finally free of caring what either of them thinks." The Pemberton Gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Ashford estate, a sprawling palace that made even Blackthorn Castle look modest. 300 guests from the most powerful families in the kingdom, all gathered to celebrate Lady Pemberton's 30th year of charitable work. It was the social event of the winter season, and Serafina had confirmed her attendance without Adrian, citing his prior commitment to a council meeting that he had scheduled specifically to avoid this event. She arrived alone, which was itself a statement. Duchesses did not attend galas without their husbands, unless the husband was gravely ill or dead. Her entrance caused a ripple of whispers that spread through the ballroom like fire through dry grass. Lady Charlotte met her at the top of the stairs, resplendent in deep green silk that complemented her dark hair. She linked arms with Serafina in a gesture of solidarity that everyone in the room would notice and interpret correctly. "You are magnificent," Charlotte murmured as they descended into the crowd. "Every eye is on you." "Good," Serafina said. "Let them look." Lady Pemberton greeted them warmly, her eyes twinkling with something that looked like pride. "My dear Duchess, I am so pleased you could attend. And without the Duke. How refreshingly modern of you." The words were carefully chosen. Modern was code for progressive, for independent, for everything that Adrian's world considered dangerous. Serafina smiled and accepted the compliment, while mentally noting that Pemberton had just publicly aligned herself with Serafina's quiet rebellion. The evening unfolded with strategic precision. Serafina made certain to speak with every family that Adrian had political tensions with. She laughed genuinely at Magistrate Thorne's stories about courtroom absurdities, knowing that spies in the crowd would report back to Adrian that his wife had been seen enjoying the company of his rival. She accepted Lady Ashford's invitation to visit the family's western estates, an invitation that came with the unspoken weight of the Ashford family's significant political influence. And through it all, she performed the most subversive act of all. She appeared happy. Across the city in a council chamber that smelled of old wood and older grudges, Adrian sat through a budget meeting that required none of his attention. His mind was at the Pemberton Gala, imagining his wife among people who would see her attendance alone as evidence of marital discord. He told himself it did not matter. Serafina's choices reflected poorly only on herself. The Duchy's reputation remained intact because he remained above reproach. But doubt had begun to creep through cracks in his certainty. His mother's words echoed in his skull. "Assert your authority before she spirals beyond control." Lord Ashford's casual mention that morning that he looked forward to seeing the Duchess at the gala said with a smile that suggested he knew Adrian would not be there. The way his own secretary had hesitated before confirming Serafina's travel arrangements, as if uncertain whether to report his employer's wife's movements. Control was an illusion built on compliance. Adrian was beginning to understand that compliance had ended weeks ago, and he had been too arrogant to notice. The meeting adjourned near midnight. Adrian returned to Blackthorn Castle to find it dark except for a few servant quarters. Serafina's chambers were dark as well. She had not yet returned. He stood outside her door like a fool, listening for sounds that did not come, feeling something uncomfortably close to anxiety twist in his chest. He went to his own chambers and did not sleep. Instead, he sat at his window watching the road that led from the city, telling himself he was simply ensuring his wife's safe return and not admitting that for the first time in their marriage, he had no idea where she was or when she would come back. Serafina arrived home near 2 a.m, driven by Lady Charlotte's carriage, in a pointed gesture that ensured everyone at the gala knew she had not traveled alone into the night. She was laughing as she stepped down onto the cobblestones, her breath misting in the cold air, her cheeks flushed from champagne and something that looked dangerously like joy. Adrian watched from his window as his wife walked through the castle gates looking more alive than he had seen her in years. And for the first time, a question pierced through his armor of certainty. What had he done? What? The question haunted him through the following week as Serafina's absences became more frequent and more public. She attended Magistrate Thorne's lecture on marriage law reform, sitting in the front row and taking notes while Adrian's political opponents watched with barely concealed satisfaction. She joined Lady Charlotte's literary salon, where progressive women discussed novels that Adrian considered inappropriate and politics that he considered dangerous. She accepted an invitation to speak at the Orphanage Reform Committee's monthly meeting, delivering a speech about the rights of abandoned children that was printed in the capital's newspaper the next day. Each action was a small earthquake. Together, they threatened to collapse the foundation of everything Adrian had built his identity upon. His mother summoned him to her townhouse with increasing frequency, each visit a litany of criticism and catastrophic predictions. The council is talking. Your wife has made you look weak. You must do something before this becomes irreparable. Adrian listened with growing numbness. His mother's voice had always been the voice of reason in his mind, the steady compass that pointed toward duty and tradition. But now her words sounded like fear disguised as wisdom. She was not concerned about his happiness or even his marriage. She was concerned about the family reputation, the Whitemore legacy, the same cold calculation that had governed his entire life. "What would you have me do?" he finally asked, interrupting her mid-sentence about the importance of making an example. "Bring her to heel," Isolde said simply. "Remind her who holds the power in this marriage. And if she refuses, then you divorce her and marry someone suitable. Lady Cordelia Ashford is still unwed." Adrian stared at his mother and saw clearly for the first time what he had always refused to acknowledge. She had never wanted him to be happy. She wanted him to be powerful. There was a difference, and that difference had cost him everything that mattered. He left his mother's townhouse without another word, ignoring her calls after him. The cold air hit his face like clarity. He did not want to divorce Serafina. The realization came with the force of something obvious he should have known all along. He did not want to replace her with Lady Cordelia or anyone else. He wanted his wife back. The problem was that he had no idea how to get her back because he was not entirely certain when he had lost her. He returned to Blackthorn Castle and did something he had not done in 4 months. He went to Serafina's chambers and knocked on her door at a decent hour, waiting to be invited inside instead of commanding her presence in his study. "Come in," her voice called. He entered to find her at her writing desk, working on correspondence by lamplight. She did not stand or show any sign of surprise at his appearance, just looked at him with polite inquiry, as if he were a servant asking about household matters. "We need to talk," Adrian said. "About what?" "About us." The word felt foreign in his mouth. Us. As if they were a unit instead of two people occupying the same legal arrangement. Serafina set down her pen and folded her hands, giving him her full attention in a way that felt more terrifying than her earlier dismissals. "Go ahead," she said. Adrian had prepared a speech during the ride back from his mother's. Reasonable points about duty and reputation and the necessity of presenting a united front. But standing in his wife's chambers, watching her look at him with the patient indifference one might show a stranger, all his prepared words dissolved. "I do not understand what is happening," he said instead, and the admission felt like defeat. "What part do you not understand?" "Any of it. You were content for years. Now suddenly you're acting like I have been torturing you." Serafina's laugh was soft and bitter. "Content." "Adrian, I have not been content since our 2nd year of marriage. I have been surviving. There is a difference. You never said anything. I said everything. You simply were not listening. That is unfair. I have always listened." "No?" Serafina said, standing now, moving to face him with her arms crossed. "You have always heard. Listening requires caring about what is being said. You hear the words and dismiss them because they do not fit your worldview. I could tell you I was dying, and you would respond by asking if it would interfere with next week's banquet schedule." The words hit like physical blows. Adrian felt his jaw tighten, his instinct to defend himself warring with the uncomfortable recognition that she might be right. "If you were so unhappy, you should have told me directly." "I did. I told you I was lonely. You said I needed more household responsibilities. I told you I missed my family. You said duty comes before sentiment. I told you I felt invisible. You said I was being oversensitive. At what point, Adrian, was I supposed to keep throwing myself against your walls, hoping one day you might notice I was bleeding?" Her voice had not risen, but the intensity in it was devastating. Adrian found himself taking a step back, physically retreating from the force of emotions he had no framework for processing. "I have provided for you," he said, grasping for solid ground. "You have wanted for nothing, except you. I wanted you. Not your money or your title or your fucking castle. I wanted a husband who looked at me like I mattered, who asked about my day not because it was polite, but because he actually cared about the answer, who touched me like he desired me instead of performing obligation. But you gave me none of that. You gave me a comfortable prison and wondered why I did not seem grateful." Adrian felt something crack in his chest. When he spoke, his voice came out rougher than intended. "I did not know. You did not want to know. There is a difference." The silence stretched between them, filled with 7 years of accumulated damage. Adrian had spent his entire life learning how to negotiate treaties and navigate political conflicts, but he had never learned how to have this conversation, how to admit failure without it destroying him, how to be vulnerable with another person when vulnerability had always been trained out of him. "What do you want me to do?" he finally asked. "Nothing," Serafina said, and the word was final. "I do not want you to do anything, Adrian. It is too late for grand gestures or sudden changes. You are who you are, and I have finally accepted that. I want a divorce." The word landed like a blade between ribs. Divorce. The thing that happened to other families, lesser families, families that could not control their emotions or maintain proper dignity. Not the Whitemores. Never the Whitemores. That is not possible. It is entirely possible. I have consulted with attorneys. I understand the process. Attorneys. The word tasted like betrayal. "You have been planning this. For weeks now, yes." Adrian felt his world tilting. All this time, he had thought Serafina was going through some temporary crisis, acting out like a child throwing a tantrum, but she had been methodical, strategic. She had outmaneuvered him while he was still convinced he held all the power. I will not grant you a divorce. Then I will make it impossible for you to refuse. What does that mean? It means that I am no longer interested in protecting your reputation at the expense of my freedom. I will become so publicly independent, so visibly separate from you, that staying married will be more damaging to your precious legacy than letting me go. Your mother already sees it happening. The council is starting to question why you cannot control your own wife. How long do you think before they start wondering what other things you cannot control? She delivered this with calm certainty, like a general explaining battle strategy to a defeated opponent. Adrian stared at the woman he had married and barely recognized her. Or perhaps he had never truly known her at all. You would destroy both of us out of spite? No, Serafina said, moving back to her desk and resuming her correspondence as if he had already left. I would free both of us because staying in this marriage is destroying me, and you are too proud to admit it is destroying you too. She picked up her pen, a clear dismissal. Adrian stood frozen for another moment, his entire identity crumbling around him. The Duke who controlled everything. The man who made no mistakes. The husband who had somehow lost his wife without even noticing she was leaving. He walked out without another word because he had none left. In the hallway, he pressed his back against the wall and tried to breathe through the sensation that his ribcage was collapsing inward. For the first time in his adult life, Adrian Whitemore had no plan, no strategy, no clear path forward, only the devastating knowledge that he had already lost something he had been too foolish to value while he still had it. The next morning brought news that accelerated everything. Lady Pemberton's Orphanage Reform Committee had elected Serafina as their treasurer, a position that came with considerable public visibility and budget authority. The announcement was printed in all the major newspapers, complete with a quote from Pemberton herself praising the Duchess's dedication to progressive causes. Adrian read the article over breakfast while his coffee went cold. Treasurer meant regular meetings, public accountability. Her name on official documents that had nothing to do with him or his authority. It was another step toward separation, another brick removed from the foundation of their marriage. His mother arrived before noon, furious and frightened in equal measure. She stormed into his study without knocking, brandishing the newspaper like evidence of crimes. "Do you see what she is doing?" Isolde's voice was sharp enough to cut. "She is building a life that does not include you. Soon she will not need your protection or your name. And then what leverage do you have?" Adrian did not look up from the paperwork he was pretending to review. "I am aware of the situation. Then act. Forbid her from this committee. Cut off her access to funds. Make it clear that this behavior will not be tolerated. I have tried that already. It did not work, because you are being too soft." Isolde moved closer, her eyes glittering with the kind of certainty that had guided her through decades of court politics. "You are a duke, Adrian. You do not ask. You do not negotiate. You command and you punish disobedience. She is not a subject to be commanded. She is your wife. That makes her exactly that." Adrian finally looked up at his mother and saw in her face the same cold calculation that had governed his childhood. Love as leverage. Relationships as power structures. Human connection reduced to strategic advantage. He had learned these lessons so well that he had applied them to his own marriage without questioning whether they might be fundamentally wrong. "Get out," he said quietly. Isolde froze. "Excuse me? Get out of my study. Out of my castle. I will handle my marriage without your counsel. You are making a catastrophic mistake. Then it will be my mistake to make. Not yours. Not anymore." Isolde stared at him with something between shock and fury. For a moment, Adrian thought she might argue further, but his mother had spent too many years navigating power dynamics not to recognize when she had lost leverage. She turned and left without another word, her spine rigid with offense. Adrian sat in the silence she left behind and wondered if this was what growth felt like. Painful. Isolating. Necessary. He pulled out fresh paper and began to write. Not commands or demands. Not even a letter, really. Just words trying to capture thoughts he had spent 35 years avoiding. "I am sorry. I do not know if those words mean anything now. I do not know if they ever meant anything to you, but I am writing them because they are true, and I have spent too long hiding from truths that made me uncomfortable. You said, I gave you a comfortable prison. You were right. I built it carefully, brick by brick. Every rule and expectation, another bar in the cage, I told myself, was protection. I told myself I was being a good husband by providing stability. Structure. All the things my father told me a duke provides. I never asked what you needed. I assumed you needed what I could give. When you tried to tell me otherwise, I dismissed it as emotion interfering with reason, as if emotion was weakness instead of the only thing that makes any of this bearable. I do not know how to be different. I have spent my entire life learning how to be a duke and no time learning how to be a husband. The skills do not overlap as much as I thought they would. You want a divorce. I understand why. You have every right to want freedom from a man who treated you like furniture to be maintained rather than a person to be known. I will not fight it anymore. If leaving me is what you need to survive, then I will not trap you here. You deserve better than what I have given you. I'm sorry I did not understand that sooner. Adrian. He folded the letter and sealed it before he could reconsider. Then he called for a servant and had it delivered to Serafina's chambers immediately. She received it an hour later, sitting at her desk, preparing a speech for the Reform Committee's next meeting. She recognized Adrian's handwriting and considered not opening it. More commands, more expectations, more disappointment when she refused to comply. But curiosity won. She broke the seal and read words she had never expected to see from the man she married. The letter shook in her hands by the end, not from emotion, from shock that Adrian Whitemore had finally admitted fault for anything. She read it twice more, searching for manipulation or strategy. But the words felt raw in a way Adrian never allowed himself to be. This was not a duke writing to his Duchess. This was a man writing to a woman he had failed, finally understanding the magnitude of that failure. Serafina set the letter down and stared at it for a long time. 7 years of hoping for exactly this. 7 years of waiting for Adrian to see her, to hear her, to understand that a marriage required more than duty and structure. And now, when she had finally stopped waiting, when she had built enough armor around her heart that his words could not penetrate, he offered her what she had once desperately needed. The timing was almost funny. Almost. She pulled out her journal and wrote a single line. Too late. Finally too late. Then she returned to her speech about orphan welfare and tried not to think about the man sitting alone in his study waiting for a response that would never come. 3 days passed in careful silence. Adrian went about his duties with mechanical precision while internally waiting for Serafina's reaction to his letter. An acknowledgement. A conversation. Something to indicate the words had mattered. Nothing came. Serafina attended her committee meetings and social engagements with increasing confidence. She had lunch with Lady Ashford at the family's city residence, a gesture that carried significant political weight since the Ashfords had long been in subtle competition with the Whitemores for northern influence. She gave an interview to a progressive newspaper about the importance of women's education that was reprinted in 5 different publications. Each action was another step toward independence, each appearance another nail in the coffin of their marriage. Adrian found himself in his mother's position, watching his wife slip away and having no tools to stop it. The difference was that he was beginning to understand she should never have needed stopping. She should have been free all along. The breaking point came on a Friday evening when Adrian returned from a council meeting to find Serafina's personal maid supervising the removal of trunks from her chambers. Not all her belongings, just enough to make clear she was establishing a second residence somewhere else. "What is happening?" Adrian said, his voice tight. The maid curtsied nervously. "The Duchess is relocating some items to her new estate, Your Grace." "What new estate?" Serafina appeared at the top of the stairs, elegant in traveling clothes that made clear she would be leaving soon. "Lady Charlotte has graciously offered me use of her country residence until I secure my own property. I am moving there tomorrow." Adrian felt the ground shift under his feet. Moving. She was actually leaving, not threatening, not posturing, actually packing her life into trunks and walking out of Blackthorn Castle. "You cannot do this." "I can and I am. We are still married." "A technicality I intend to rectify," Serafina said, descending the stairs with calm purpose. "My attorney believes we can have the annulment processed within 6 months if you cooperate. Less time if you do not." "Annulment," Adrian repeated. "Not even divorce." Annulment meant erasing the marriage as if it had never existed, as if 7 years could be legally deleted from history. It is cleaner this way, Serafina said. Grounds are incompatibility and failure to produce an heir. No blame, no scandal. We simply acknowledge what has always been true. We were never suited for each other. She moved past him toward the door where her carriage waited. Adrian followed her out into the courtyard where snow was beginning to fall again, covering everything in white that would soon turn to gray. I read your letter, Serafina said without looking at him. And it was everything I needed to hear 7 years ago. But not today. Today it just confirmed what I already knew. You're capable of growth, Adrian, of introspection, of honesty. You were simply never willing to offer me those things when it might have made a difference. I am willing now. Now is too late. She climbed into the carriage, and Adrian stood watching as the woman he had failed drove through the gates of Blackthorn Castle, possibly for the last time. Snow fell on his shoulders and hair, while servants whispered behind him, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the mighty Duke would finally break. But Adrian did not break. Breaking would have been a release. Instead, he felt something far worse. The slow, crushing weight of understanding that some mistakes cannot be undone no matter how much you regret them. That some people leave and do not come back no matter how desperately you finally want them to stay. He turned back to the castle that suddenly felt enormous and empty. In his study, Serafina's letter still sat on his desk, the divorce papers she had left behind. Evidence of an ending that had been inevitable from the beginning because he had never learned how to be what she needed. Adrian sat in the darkness and stared at papers that would dissolve 7 years with a signature. And for the first time since his father died and left him the duchy at 28, Adrian Whitemore allowed himself to feel the full weight of his failures. The castle was silent around him. Outside, snow continued to fall on empty courtyards. And somewhere across the city, his wife was beginning a life that did not include him, finally free from the man who had loved her too late to matter. Adrian spent the first week after Serafina's departure trying to maintain the illusion that nothing fundamental had changed. He attended council meetings with the same cold efficiency, reviewed estate reports with mechanical precision, signed documents that required his authority while feeling increasingly disconnected from the power those signatures represented. But the castle knew. Servants whispered in corridors. His secretary delivered messages with carefully neutral expressions that somehow conveyed pity. Even Lord Ashford had the audacity to ask during a grain negotiation if the Duke was feeling well, noting he seemed distracted. Adrian was not distracted. He was drowning. The difference was that drowning men do not always thrash. Sometimes they just sink quietly while maintaining perfect posture. He found himself walking past Serafina's chambers multiple times a day, stopping outside the door like he might hear her voice or catch some evidence she had returned. The rooms remained empty, her personal items removed. Even her scent had faded from the air, replaced by the generic smell of unused space. It was pathetic. He knew it was pathetic. A duke reduced to haunting his own castle, hoping for ghosts that would not materialize. On the 8th day, his mother returned. Adrian was in the library reviewing land surveys when Duchess Isolde swept in without announcement, her expression carved from stone and righteousness. She had not spoken to him since he had ordered her out of his study, but clearly silence had an expiration date. I warned you, she said without preamble. I told you what would happen if you did not assert control. Now look at the disaster you have created. Adrian did not look up from the map spread across his desk. If you have come to lecture me, you can leave the same way you entered. The entire kingdom is talking about your failed marriage. The council questions your judgment. Your enemies smell weakness. And you sit here surrounded by papers pretending everything is manageable. What would you have me do? Adrian said, finally meeting her eyes. Chain her to the castle? Force her into compliance? She's gone, mother. I cannot command someone who is no longer here. Then bring her back. Make her an offer she cannot refuse. Promise her whatever she wants. Lie if you must. Just fix this before it destroys everything your father built. Adrian felt something cold settle in his chest. This was what his mother believed marriage was. Negotiation and manipulation. Lies dressed as compromise. No wonder his parents' union had been so lifeless. They had both been playing the same game of strategic advantage disguised as partnership. I will not lie to her, Adrian said quietly. Then you are a fool. Isolde moved closer, her voice dropping to the tone she used when imparting lessons she considered vital. Love is a luxury for people without empires to protect. Your father understood that. He married me because the match strengthened the family. We performed our duties, we provided heirs, we maintained appearances. That is how dynasties survive. And were you happy? The question seemed to surprise her. Happy? What does happiness have to do with anything? Everything, Adrian said. It has everything to do with everything. I spent 7 years making Serafina as miserable as you apparently were in your marriage, following your example, father's example, treating human connection like a contract to be managed. And now I am alone in a castle that feels like a tomb, understanding too late that maybe happiness was the only thing that actually mattered. Isolde stared at him with something between pity and contempt. You are weak, she said finally, just like I always feared you would be. Then I am weak, Adrian replied. If caring about my wife makes me weak, I will accept that label. His mother left without another word, her disappointment hanging in the air like smoke. Adrian sat in the silence and felt strangely liberated. For the first time in his life, he had chosen his own judgment over his mother's counsel. It was terrifying and necessary in equal measure. 2 days later, a letter arrived that changed everything. The seal was unfamiliar, belonging to a law firm Adrian had never dealt with. He opened it expecting business correspondence. Instead, he found a carefully worded document that made his blood run cold. Duke Whitemore, we represent the estate of the late magistrate Edmund Thorne, who passed unexpectedly last month. Among his private papers, we discovered correspondence that we believe you should see immediately. The enclosed letters suggest activities by members of your household that may have materially affected your marriage. We recommend you review these documents with urgency and discretion. Attached were copies of letters spanning 6 years, all of them written on Blackthorn Castle stationery, all of them signed by Duchess Isolde Whitemore. Adrian read the first letter and felt the ground dissolve beneath him. Magistrate Thorne, I write to you as someone who understands the delicate nature of family reputation. My son's marriage to Lady Vale was a mistake born of youthful sentiment. She lacks the breeding and strength required for her position. I ask your counsel on legal avenues to dissolve this union without scandal. The Vale family has little influence and less money. Surely there are grounds we might pursue that would free Adrian from this unfortunate attachment before it produces heirs that would permanently bind us to inferior bloodlines. The date was from their 2nd year of marriage, when Adrian still believed they had time to build something meaningful, when Serafina was still trying to win his mother's approval. He read the second letter with hands that had begun to shake. Your advice regarding annulment grounds has proven useful. I have begun documenting incidents that might suggest incompatibility. Lady Serafina's friendship with that radical Charlotte de Bois, for instance. Her tendency toward emotional outbursts when confronted with proper guidance. Small things that accumulate into a pattern of unsuitability. The third letter made him nauseous. I must report success in my efforts to create distance between Adrian and his wife. I have intercepted several of Lady Serafina's letters to her family and replaced them with versions emphasizing her contentment here, thus reducing their concern and her support system. I have also taken the liberty of sharing with Adrian carefully edited accounts of his wife's behavior at social functions, framing her natural warmth as inappropriate familiarity. He is beginning to see her as I do, a liability rather than an asset. Adrian's vision blurred. He forced himself to read the remaining letters, each one documenting his mother's systematic campaign to destroy his marriage from the inside, lies about Serafina's activities, forged correspondence that made his wife's family seem indifferent to her loneliness, manipulated situations designed to make Adrian question Serafina's judgment and loyalty. The final letter was dated 4 months ago, right before Serafina had begun her public separation. Adrian has become unfortunately sentimental about his wife of late. I fear he may be developing actual affection for the girl, which would complicate our plans. I recommend we accelerate our timeline. If we can create enough public embarrassment around her behavior, he will have no choice but to divorce her to protect the family name. Once she is gone, we can arrange a proper match with Lady Cordelia. The Ashford alliance will more than compensate for any temporary scandal. The letter fell from Adrian's hands. He sat frozen in his chair while understanding washed over him in waves of horrified clarity. Every suspicion he had planted in his own mind about Serafina's conduct, every doubt about her loyalty, every moment he had chosen to believe his mother's interpretation over his wife's words, all of it orchestrated, manufactured, built on lies so careful and so consistent that he had never thought to question them. His mother had not been trying to protect him. She had been trying to control him. And Serafina had been collateral damage in a power struggle Adrian had been too blind to recognize. He thought back to moments that suddenly made terrible sense. The time Serafina had accused him of never receiving her letters home, and he had dismissed her concern as paranoia. The occasions when she had tried to tell him about conversations with his mother that contradicted his mother's accounts, and he had chosen to believe Isolda's version because why would a mother lie to her son? The slow erosion of trust between husband and wife while a third party whispered poison in both their ears. Adrian stood on legs that barely supported his weight. His entire worldview was collapsing. Not just his marriage, his understanding of family, of loyalty, of who he could trust and who had been manipulating him for years. The worst part was understanding that even without his mother's interference, he had still failed Serafina. The lies had made everything worse, but the foundation of his cruelty had been his own. His emotional distance, his obsessive need for control, his inability to see his wife as a person rather than a position to be managed. Isolda had exploited those weaknesses, but she had not created them. He was responsible. Even with new information about his mother's betrayal, that core truth remained unchanged. Adrian called for his secretary immediately. The young man appeared within minutes, looking nervous at the Duke's expression. "Find out where my wife is staying. I need her address within the hour." "Lady Serafina is residing at the Charlotte Dubois country estate, Your Grace, about 30 miles northwest. Prepare my horse. I leave within the hour." "Your Grace, it is nearly evening and snow is expected. Perhaps morning would be—" "Within the hour," Adrian repeated, his voice allowing no argument. 40 minutes later, he was riding through gates he had not passed in years, heading toward the one person who deserved to know the full extent of the betrayals that had poisoned their marriage. The one person he had wronged so thoroughly that no apology could possibly be sufficient. The one person he absolutely had to try to explain this to anyway, even if she refused to listen. The Dubois country estate was smaller than Blackthorn Castle, but infinitely warmer, lit from within by golden lamplight that spilled across snow-covered grounds. Adrian dismounted in the courtyard and was immediately greeted by a suspicious house manager who clearly recognized him and did not seem pleased about his arrival. "The Duchess is not receiving visitors at this hour. Tell her it is urgent. Tell her I have information about my mother that she needs to hear." The manager hesitated, then disappeared inside. Adrian waited in the cold, his breath misting in air that felt too thin for adequate breathing. Every second stretched into eternity, while he rehearsed words that could never be adequate for what he needed to say. The door opened, but it was not Serafina who emerged. It was Lady Charlotte, wrapped in a shawl and looking at Adrian with unconcealed hostility. "You have considerable audacity coming here. I need to speak with my wife." "Your wife," Charlotte said, her voice sharp as broken glass, "has spent the past week learning how to sleep without nightmares for the first time in years. She has laughed genuinely, eaten full meals, begun to remember who she was before you systematically destroyed her sense of self. And now you arrive unannounced, expecting what exactly? That she will drop everything to hear whatever excuse you have prepared? This is not an excuse. I have proof that my mother has been sabotaging our marriage for years. Serafina deserves to know." Charlotte's expression flickered. "Proof?" Adrian held up the packet of letters. 6 years of documented manipulation, intercepted correspondence, fabricated incidents. My mother has been orchestrating our destruction since the beginning. "And you believed her lies because it was easier than admitting you were a terrible husband on your own merit?" The words hit like stones, but Adrian did not flinch. "Yes. I believed her because I wanted to believe I was justified in my cruelty. The lies gave me permission to maintain distance I was already choosing. I am complicit in every moment of Serafina's suffering, but she still deserves to know the full truth of what was done to us." Charlotte studied him for a long moment. Then she turned and disappeared inside. Adrian waited, hope and dread warring in his chest. When the door opened again, Serafina stood framed in light that made her look ethereal. She wore a simple dress in deep blue, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way she never would have appeared at Blackthorn. She looked softer here, more herself. The woman she might have been if he had not spent 7 years trying to mold her into something else. "What do you want, Adrian?" Her voice was not hostile, just tired, as if his presence was an inconvenience rather than the emotional crisis it felt like to him. "I need to show you something," he said, holding out the letters. "Please. 5 minutes. Then I will leave and never bother you again if that is what you want." Serafina descended the steps with careful grace. She took the letters from his hand without their fingers touching, as if proximity might be contagious. Adrian watched her face as she read, searching for recognition or shock or anger. Instead, she just looked sad. She finished the last letter and handed the packet back to him. Her expression had not changed. "You knew," Adrian said, realization dawning with horrible clarity. "You already knew about this." "Not all of it," Serafina said quietly, "but enough. I figured out your mother was intercepting my letters home in year 3. I discovered she was lying to you about my behavior around year 4. By year 5, I understood that she was actively trying to destroy our marriage, and you were too willing to believe her to ever take my side. Why did you not tell me? I tried. Multiple times. You dismissed every concern as me being oversensitive or jealous of your mother's influence. Eventually, I stopped trying because what was the point? You had already chosen who you wanted to believe." Adrian felt something crack in his chest. If you had known what? You would have defended me? Chosen me over your mother? Adrian, the problem was never that you did not have enough information. The problem was that you did not love me enough to give me the benefit of doubt when information conflicted. Your mother's lies worked because you wanted them to be true. They confirmed your existing belief that I was inadequate. That is not. "It is exactly true," Serafina interrupted. "Do you know how many times I told you something and you immediately asked your mother for her version? How many times you took her word over mine without question? She was manipulating you, yes, but you were a willing participant in that manipulation because it justified the emotional distance you preferred to maintain anyway." Adrian had no defense because she was absolutely right. The letters had revealed his mother's betrayal, but they could not erase his own. Even knowing about Isolde's schemes, he could not claim he would have acted differently. His cruelty had been his own choice, enabled by his mother's lies, but never caused by them. "I am sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate and essential simultaneously. "For all of it. For believing her. For not believing you. For every moment I made you feel invisible or insignificant or trapped. You deserved a husband who fought for you, and I gave you someone who barely acknowledged your existence." Serafina's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "Yes, you did. And I'm sorry too." "For what?" "You did nothing wrong. I stayed too long. I should have left after year 3 when I realized your mother was sabotaging us and you were not interested in seeing it. I should have protected myself instead of hoping you would eventually love me enough to notice I was drowning. I'm sorry I wasted 7 years of both our lives waiting for something that was never going to happen." "It could happen now," Adrian said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Now that I know, now that I understand what was done to us, we could start over." Serafina shook her head slowly. "No, we could not. Because even knowing about your mother's interference, you are still the same man who chose duty over connection, structure over emotion, your empire over your wife. Those letters did not make you that person, Adrian. You were always that person. Your mother just gave you convenient excuses. I can change. Perhaps you can. But I'm not interested in waiting around to find out. I have spent 7 years being shaped by your expectations, being diminished by your indifference. I am finally becoming myself again. I will not sacrifice that to give you another chance at getting it right." The finality in her voice was more devastating than anger would have been. Adrian felt the last thread of hope snap. "What about my mother?" he said, grasping for something solid. "She committed fraud, destroyed correspondence, manipulated both of us. There should be consequences." "There should be," Serafina agreed, "but pursuing her would require me to remain entangled with your family. I would rather walk away from all of it. Your mother, your castle, you. I just want my freedom. So that is it. 7 years erased because I made mistakes." No, Adrian. 7 years erased because you made choices. Consistent, deliberate choices to prioritize everything except the woman you married. Do not diminish that by calling them mistakes. Mistakes are accidental. What you did to me was policy. She turned toward the house, but Adrian could not let her leave without one final desperate attempt at salvaging something from the wreckage. I love you, he said, and the words that had never been spoken in 7 years of marriage landed like stones in snow. Serafina paused. For a moment, Adrian thought she might turn around, might acknowledge the confession that had come 7 years too late to matter. Instead, she spoke without looking back at him. I know you do. I think you probably always did in your own broken way, but love is not enough when it comes without respect or partnership or basic human decency. I needed a husband who saw me as an equal. You needed a Duchess who did not require emotional labor. We were never going to work because we wanted fundamentally different things from marriage. She climbed the steps and disappeared inside, leaving Adrian standing in the courtyard with letters documenting his mother's betrayal and the hollow victory of finally understanding exactly how much he had lost. Adrian rode back to Blackthorn Castle through falling snow that seemed determined to bury the world. His mind replayed the conversation in endless loops, searching for the moment he could have said something different, done something better, changed an outcome that had been decided long before he showed up at Charlotte Dubois' door. He arrived home near midnight to find his mother waiting in his study. She sat in his chair like she owned it, drinking his whiskey like she had every right. You went to her, Isolde said without preamble. How pathetic. Adrian crossed the room with controlled violence, slamming the packet of letters onto the desk in front of her. Isolde looked down at them, and for the first time in his life, Adrian saw fear cross his mother's face. Where did you get those? From Magistrate Thorne's estate. He kept copies of everything. Did you think you could destroy a marriage with lies and manipulation, and there would be no record, no consequences? Isolde recovered her composure with practiced ease. Everything I did was for your benefit. That girl was unsuitable. Weak. You needed someone stronger. You destroyed the one good thing in my life because it did not fit your plans for the family legacy. You sabotaged my marriage, poisoned my judgment, turned me against a woman who loved me because you could not tolerate losing control over your son. I was protecting you from your own weakness. Adrian laughed, bitter and sharp. Protecting me. You were protecting yourself. Protecting your vision of what the Whitemore family should be. Well, congratulations, Mother. You won. Serafina is leaving. The marriage is over. I am exactly the isolated, emotionally crippled Duke you wanted me to be. Watch your tone. No, Adrian said, his voice dropping to something cold and final. You watch yours. You no longer have a place in this household. You no longer have influence over my decisions. As of this moment, you are no longer welcome at Blackthorn Castle. Isolde stood, her face flushing with rage. You cannot banish me. I am the Dowager Duchess, and I am the Duke. This is my castle, my authority. You have spent years manipulating me into believing that family loyalty required tolerating your control. But family loyalty does not include enabling cruelty. You will pack your belongings and return to your city residence. All financial support will continue, but your presence here is finished. You are making a mistake. The biggest mistake I ever made was listening to you. Adrian moved to the door and opened it, where 2 guards waited on his signal. These men will escort you to your chambers to collect what you need for tonight. The rest will be sent to you tomorrow. Isolde stared at him with venom in her eyes. You will regret this. When you are alone in this castle with no heir and no allies, you will realize I was right. Perhaps, Adrian said, but I will be alone because of my own failures, not yours. There is strange comfort in that. His mother swept past him with wounded dignity, flanked by guards who had served her for decades, now treating her like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Adrian watched her go and felt nothing except exhausted relief. He spent the rest of the night burning the letters in his fireplace one by one, watching his mother's words dissolve into ash. It solved nothing, changed nothing. Serafina was still leaving, the marriage was still over, but there was something cleansing and destroying evidence of betrayals that had poisoned everything he should have protected. At dawn, he sat at his desk and began writing letters to the magistrate's estate, thanking them for their integrity in bringing the documents forward, to his secretary with instructions on transferring his mother's access to various estate accounts, to Serafina's attorney, informing him that he would not contest the annulment and would provide whatever documentation was required to expedite the process. And finally, one more letter to Serafina herself. Not begging, not demanding, just acknowledging. Serafina, I will not attempt to change your mind. You deserve freedom from this family and everything we put you through. The annulment papers will be signed and returned within the week. You will have full access to your dowry plus additional settlement funds that should allow you to establish whatever life you choose without financial constraint. I have removed my mother from Blackthorn Castle permanently. It does not fix what she did or what I did, but it ensures she can hurt no one else under my authority. You said I needed a duchess who did not require emotional labor. You were right, but what I actually needed was to become a man capable of providing that labor. I failed at that. I understand why you cannot give me another chance to try. I hope you find everything you are looking for in the life you are building. You deserve joy, peace, someone who sees you the way I should have from the beginning. I am sorry I was not that person. I am sorry I realized it too late to matter. Adrian. He sealed it and had it delivered with the morning post. Then he stood at his window watching snow cover the gardens where he had once found Serafina, sketching bare trees back when she still tried to build a life within castle walls that had become her cage. The castle felt emptier than it ever had. No wife, no mother, just Adrian and the consequences of choices he could never unmake. In the following days, news of Duchess Isolda's banishment spread through noble circles like wildfire. Speculation ran rampant. Some assumed Adrian had finally asserted independence. Others whispered about family scandals too explosive to make public. Lord Ashford sent careful inquiries. Lady Pemberton expressed sympathetic concern. Adrian responded to none of it. He attended to duchy business with mechanical efficiency while internally feeling like he was operating a body someone else controlled. He signed the annulment papers without reading them thoroughly. He approved Serafina's settlement without negotiation. He did everything he was supposed to do while understanding that doing the right thing now could never compensate for years of doing everything wrong. 3 weeks after his confrontation with Serafina, a messenger arrived from the capital with official notice. The annulment had been granted on grounds of incompatibility and mutual consent. Lady Serafina Vale was no longer the Duchess of Blackthorn. She was free. Adrian read the notice 3 times, then carefully filed it with other legal documents that marked endings he had not been prepared for. That night, he stood in what had been Serafina's chambers, now completely empty except for furniture too large to move. He had not entered this room since she left, had not wanted to confront the physical evidence of her absence. But something had drawn him here tonight, some masochistic need to feel the full weight of what he had destroyed. Her drawing desk still sat by the window where she used to sketch gardens and trees, and probably dreams of escape she never voiced. He ran his hand across the wood surface, imagining her sitting here during lonely afternoons, trying to fill empty hours in a castle full of people who never truly saw her. On a whim, he opened the desk drawer, empty except for a small leather journal wedged in the back corner. He pulled it out, recognizing it as one of many notebooks Serafina had kept over the years. He had never asked what she wrote in them, had never cared enough to wonder. He opened to a random page and read words that felt like knives. Year 5. I no longer remember what it feels like to be wanted, not needed for social obligations or political theater, but wanted as a person. Adrian looks through me now instead of at me. I have become furniture, familiar and ignored in equal measure. Adrian flipped to another entry. I tried again today to tell him about his mother's interference. He dismissed it with the same patient condescension he uses when correcting servants who have misunderstood instructions. I am not a person to him. I am a problem that refuses to resolve itself properly. Another page. I think I have finally accepted that hoping for his love is destroying me more than his indifference ever could. Hope is exhausting. Giving up is strangely peaceful. Tomorrow I stop waiting for him to become someone he has no interest in being. Adrian read entry after entry documenting his failures through Serafina's eyes. Each one was devastating, not because of anger or blame, but because of the slow resignation. The way hope transformed into acceptance, transformed into numbness, transformed finally into the determination to escape. She had not left impulsively. She had not been manipulated by outside forces. She had made the rational decision that staying would kill something essential in her spirit. And reading her words, Adrian understood she had been absolutely right. He closed the journal and sat in the gathering darkness of her empty chambers. Outside, snow continued to fall on Blackthorn Castle. Inside, Adrian Whitemore finally understood the full magnitude of his transformation from husband to jailer, from partner to obstacle. The worst part was knowing that even with all this understanding, he could not fix it. Knowledge without action was just another form of failure, and the only action Serafina needed from him was the one thing he had already given her, the freedom to walk away and never look back. Adrian stood and left the chambers, closing the door behind him with the careful finality of sealing a tomb. He returned to his study, where papers requiring his signature waited in neat stacks. The duchy required management. The estates required oversight. Life continued with mechanical precision, even when the person living it felt hollowed out and empty. This was his new existence. Duke of Blackthorn, master of nothing that mattered. Alone in a castle built on duty and tradition and the slow suffocation of everything human. He had wanted control, structure, order. Now he had it completely, and understood too late that none of it meant anything without someone to share it with who actually wanted to be there. The cruelest lesson was learning that some mistakes cannot be fixed no matter how much you have changed. That growth without redemption is just understanding your own failures more clearly. That love confessed too late becomes another burden for the person you claim to love, another reason they were right to leave. Adrian sat at his desk and stared at papers that would never care about his regrets. Outside his window, the kingdom continued in rhythms that did not require his happiness to function. And somewhere beyond castle walls, Serafina was learning how to build a life that did not include him. She would be fine. Better than fine. Free. And Adrian would remain here in the empire he had prioritized over everything else, finally understanding that empires are cold comfort when you have no one to share them with. That power is meaningless when the only person whose opinion you care about has stopped caring about yours. He pulled out fresh paper and began drafting new policies for the duchy's orphanages, implementing programs Serafina had advocated for, but he had dismissed as too expensive. It was pathetic, trying to honor her vision now that she was gone, but it was all he had left. The ability to change systems she had wanted changed, even if he could never change enough to deserve her forgiveness. This was his punishment and his penance, living with the knowledge of what he had lost and why he had lost it, understanding that some endings are permanent no matter how much you wish you could rewrite them. The snow continued falling. The castle remained empty. And Adrian Whitemore finally became the man Serafina had needed him to be 7 years too late for it to matter. Adrian spent 6 weeks implementing changes that Serafina would never witness. He restructured the orphanage funding to triple their operating budgets. He overturned council decisions that had blocked women's education initiatives. He personally reviewed every policy his mother had influenced during her decades of unofficial rule and systematically dismantled the cruelest ones. It was penance disguised as governance. Each reform was an apology. Serafina would never hear. Each policy reversal was an admission of failure carved into the legal framework of his duchy. He was becoming the man she had needed him to be while she built a life that no longer included space for him. His council noticed. Lord Ashford mentioned during a budget review that the Duke seemed unusually focused on progressive causes. Magistrate Thorne, unaware of the letters his late father had preserved, commented that these reforms aligned surprisingly well with the Duchess Serafina's former advocacy work. Former Duchess, Adrian had corrected quietly. She is no longer attached to this household. The distinction mattered to him even if it mattered to no one else. Serafina had earned her freedom. He would not taint it by continuing to claim connection she had legally severed. But the kingdom had other ideas about what belonged to whom. The first warning came from his secretary on a gray morning when frost covered the castle grounds. The man entered Adrian's study with unusual hesitation, holding a letter sealed with the royal crest. "Your Grace, this arrived from the capital. It is marked urgent." Adrian broke the seal and read words that made his blood run cold. "Duke Whitemore, the council has reviewed your recent annulment with concern. 7 years of marriage without producing an heir raises questions about your capacity to continue the Whitemore line. Additionally, your recent policy changes and the dismissal of Duchess Isolde suggest instability in leadership. We require your presence at the capital within the fortnight to address these matters formally. Failure to appear will result in a vote of no confidence in your stewardship of Northern Territories. Signed, High Counselor Marcus Thane. Adrian read it twice, understanding blooming with sick certainty. The council was questioning his authority, not because of the annulment itself, but because he had allowed it, because he had shown vulnerability, weakness. The cardinal sin of powerful men was admitting failure in anything, including marriage. His secretary cleared his throat nervously. Your Grace, there is more. Lady Cordelia Ashford has apparently expressed renewed interest in a potential match. Lord Ashford mentioned it to me this morning with considerable enthusiasm. Of course she had. Of course they had. Adrian's failed marriage was being interpreted as availability. His pain was being repackaged as opportunity. The same people who had watched him destroy Serafina through neglect now circled like vultures hoping to position their daughters for the vacant Duchess role. Prepare my travel arrangements, Adrian said flatly. I leave for the capital in 3 days. The secretary hesitated. Your Grace, perhaps you should consider Lord Ashford's overture. A new engagement might stabilize the council's concerns. I will handle the council without selling myself to the highest bidder. But Your Grace, that will be all. The man bowed and left quickly. Adrian sat alone with the royal summons and the bitter understanding that his attempts at growth were being interpreted as weakness by men who measured power and control rather than humanity. He had 2 choices: appear before the council and defend his decisions while they pressured him into another strategic marriage, or refuse and risk losing the duchy his family had controlled for 5 generations. Neither option addressed the actual problem, that he had spent 7 years destroying a woman he loved, and the consequences of that destruction were now threatening everything else he had. That night, Adrian did something he had not done since childhood. He left the castle alone without informing anyone of his destination. He saddled his horse and rode through darkness toward the Dubois estate, where Serafina had been living since the annulment. He was not going to beg her to come back. He was not delusional enough to believe that was possible. But she deserved to know what was happening, that her name was still being used by people trying to manipulate him, that even in freedom she was not entirely free of the damage his world continued to inflict. He arrived near midnight, tying his horse outside the gates and approaching on foot. Lamplight glowed in several windows. Smoke rose from chimneys into cold night air. The estate looked warm and alive in ways Blackthorn Castle never had. Adrian stood in shadows watching the house where his former wife had found peace. Part of him wanted to turn around. Riding here had been selfish. Serafina did not need him bringing his problems to her door. She had earned the right to live without his chaos bleeding into her new life. But before he could leave, the front door opened. Lady Charlotte stepped out wrapped in a cloak, followed by Serafina herself, laughing at something Charlotte had said. They moved toward the garden paths, their voices carrying in the still air. Adrian froze. He should announce himself, should make his presence known rather than lurking like some obsessive fool. But he could not move, could not stop watching Serafina in a way he had never watched her during their marriage. Really seeing her, the way she moved with easy grace now instead of the careful tension she had carried at Blackthorn. The way her laugh sounded genuine instead of performed. The way she existed in space without trying to make herself smaller. This was who she had always been underneath the weight of being his wife, and he had been too blind to see it. Charlotte noticed him first. Her posture stiffened and she said something quiet to Serafina, who turned to look directly at where Adrian stood in shadows. Even from this distance, he could see her expression shift from surprise to resignation. She said something to Charlotte, who nodded reluctantly and returned inside. Then Serafina walked toward him with deliberate steps, stopping several feet away like proximity might be dangerous. "What are you doing here, Adrian? Not angry, just tired." As if his appearance was an inconvenience rather than the catastrophic intrusion it felt like. "I needed to tell you something," Adrian said. "The council has summoned me. They are questioning my authority because of the annulment. They want me to remarry immediately to stabilize my position. And you came here to tell me this why?" Serafina's arms crossed, defensive posture that had not been necessary during their marriage because he had never bothered her enough to require defense. "Because they are using you. Using our failed marriage as evidence of my unfitness. Your name is being dragged through political maneuvering, and you deserve to know." "I see." Serafina's expression was unreadable. "And what do you expect me to do with this information?" "Nothing. I expect nothing. I just thought you should know. They stood in silence while cold wind moved through bare trees. Adrian searched for other words, better explanations for why he had ridden through the night, just to deliver information she probably did not care about. "Are they offering you Lady Cordelia?" Serafina asked suddenly. "Yes." "Are you going to accept?" "No." "Why not?" "She would give you the political alliance you need. She would perform Duchess duties without requiring emotional labor. She is everything your mother wanted for you." "She is not you." The words came out before Adrian could stop them. Serafina's expression flickered, but she recovered quickly, retreating back behind the careful neutrality she had perfected during their marriage. "That is not my problem anymore, Adrian. I know. I know it is not. But I am telling you anyway, because I'm tired of lying. I'm tired of pretending that duty matters more than the person I destroyed in service of duty. The council wants me to marry again. I will probably lose the duchy if I refuse. And I'm refusing because I would rather lose everything than repeat the same mistakes with someone else." "Very noble," Serafina said, her voice sharp. "You have learned regret. Congratulations. That does not change anything for me. I am not asking it to. I'm just telling you that some people do not get second chances, and I am finally understanding I am one of them. You were right to leave. I was wrong about everything, and now I am losing my position because I cannot pretend anymore that power matters more than the human cost of maintaining it." Serafina studied him with eyes that had seen through his masks for years, even when he had not realized he was wearing them. When she spoke, her voice was softer, but no less final. "I am sorry the council is punishing you for growth. That is unfair. But I cannot save you from consequences of your own making, Adrian. You have to face this yourself." "I know. I'm not here asking for rescue. I just wanted you to know that letting you go was the first honest thing I have done in years, even if it cost me everything else." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Adrian." He looked back. Serafina had stepped closer, her expression complex with emotions he could not fully read. "For what it is worth, I believe you have changed. I think you are genuinely trying to become better. But that does not mean I can be part of your life while you figure out who that person is. You understand that, right?" "Yes," Adrian said quietly. "I understand." "Good." She wrapped her cloak tighter against the cold. "Then go face your council. Defend your choices. Do not let them force you into another loveless political arrangement just to keep power you are not even certain you want anymore." "How do you know I do not want it?" "Because I know you. Better than you think I do. You're starting to realize that the duchy was your father's dream, not yours. That you have been performing a role instead of living a life. That realization is terrifying, but it is also freedom." The words hit with the force of truth Adrian had been avoiding. Serafina was right. She had always been right about him, even when he had refused to listen. "What if I lose everything?" he said. "Then you lose everything and discover what is left when the performance ends. Maybe nothing. Maybe something worth having. Either way, you will know." She turned back toward the house, then paused. "One more thing. Whatever you decide about the council, make sure it is your choice. Not your mother's legacy, not your father's expectations. Yours. You have spent your whole life being what other people needed. Try being what you actually are, even if you have no idea what that is yet." She disappeared inside, leaving Adrian standing in the cold with words that felt like both verdict and benediction. She was not coming back. She was not offering forgiveness or reconciliation, but she had given him something more valuable, permission to choose himself even if that choice led to destruction. Adrian rode back to Blackthorn Castle as dawn broke over frozen landscapes. He spent the journey thinking about the council and their ultimatum, about Lady Cordelia and the strategic alliance she represented, about the duchy and whether he actually wanted to keep leading something he had never chosen for himself. By the time he reached the castle gates, he had made his decision. He would go to the capital, he would face the council, and he would tell them the truth that would probably destroy his position, but might finally let him live with himself. Some men are remembered for empires they built, others for empires they walked away from. Adrian was about to discover which kind of legacy was actually worth leaving. Ux. The capital was a city of calculated grandeur, where every building served as testimony to power concentrated in too few hands. Adrian arrived 3 days later, his arrival noted by spies before his carriage had fully stopped. Word traveled fast in circles where information was currency. He had been given rooms at the palace, a courtesy extended to dukes being summoned for review. The accommodations were luxurious and subtly threatening, gold leaf and velvet curtains that felt like beautiful chains, servants who were obviously reporting his every movement. Adrian spent his first evening reviewing documents his secretary had prepared. Council precedents for removing dukes who had fallen out of favor, historical cases of forced marriages for political stability, legal frameworks for stripping noble titles when heirs were not produced within certain time frames. It was a playbook for destroying him if he did not comply. The council had done this before to nobles who had forgotten that power was loaned, not owned. That authority came with expectations enforced through mechanisms both legal and ruthless. The formal hearing was scheduled for the following afternoon. Adrian spent the morning walking the city streets alone, something dukes generally did not do, but he no longer cared about maintaining appropriate distance. He passed markets where merchants sold produce from farms he technically controlled. He saw children playing in squares maintained by taxes he collected. He watched the machinery of civilization that existed because people like him managed it with varying degrees of competence and humanity. For the first time, he questioned whether he was actually good at this, whether his cold efficiency had benefited anyone or just maintained systems that served power at the expense of people, whether Serafina's departure had revealed not just failures in his marriage, but failures in everything he had built his identity around. The council chamber was exactly as imposing as intended. High ceilings that made individuals feel small, dark wood paneling that absorbed light and sound. 20 council members seated in a semicircle around a single chair where Adrian would defend himself to men who had already decided his guilt. High Councillor Thane presided, a man in his 60s who had maneuvered through court politics for 4 decades without ever appearing to exert effort. His face was pleasant and his eyes were knives. Duke Whitemore, thank you for attending. Please, sit. Adrian sat. The chair was positioned lower than the council seats, a subtle power play that anyone paying attention would notice. He noticed. Let them have their theater. We have several concerns we would like to address, Thane began, opening a folder thick with documents. Your recent annulment, your dismissal of the Dowager Duchess Isolde from your household, your dramatic policy reversals on matters your family has held positions on for generations, and most troubling, your failure to produce an heir in 7 years of marriage. These matters collectively suggest instability that concerns this council. Adrian kept his expression neutral. What specifically concerns you? Your judgment, Thane said simply. A duke who cannot maintain a marriage, manage his own mother, or secure his bloodline raises questions about his capacity to manage territories that support thousands of citizens. My marriage failed because I was a terrible husband. My mother was removed because she was manipulating duchy affairs for personal agenda. My policy changes reflect growth and understanding rather than instability. And my lack of heirs reflects biological timing and a failed relationship, not incapacity. Next question. The council members shifted. Apparently directness was not the defense strategy they had expected. Lord Ashford leaned forward. Duke Whitemore, we are offering you a path forward. My daughter Cordelia is willing to consider a match. Such a union would stabilize your position and provide the alliance our territories need. It is a reasonable solution. It is a transaction disguised as a solution, Adrian said. And I am no longer interested in treating marriage as a business arrangement. You treated your previous marriage that way, Councillor Brennan pointed out. Why the sudden change in philosophy? Because my previous marriage taught me that business arrangements make terrible foundations for human relationships. I destroyed a good woman by treating her like a political asset. I will not repeat that mistake. Then you admit failure in your judgment, Thane said smoothly. I admit failure in my humanity. My judgment is fine. Better now than before, actually, since I am no longer allowing political pressure to override basic decency. The room went silent. This was not how these proceedings typically went. Dukes were supposed to be contrite, apologetic, willing to accept guidance from the council's collective wisdom. Adrian's defiance was either courage or suicide. Probably both. Duke Whitemore, Thane said carefully, let me be very clear. This council has the authority to remove you from stewardship of Blackthorn territories if we determine you are unfit. We are offering you a path to avoid that outcome. I suggest you reconsider your tone. Adrian leaned back in his chair, a posture of relaxation that bordered on insolence. Let me be clear in return. I have spent 35 years being the Duke everyone expected me to be. Cold, efficient, prioritizing power over everything else. It destroyed my marriage and nearly destroyed me. I am done performing that role. If this council wants to remove me because I refuse to marry someone I do not love, because I choose to update policies that harm vulnerable populations, because I will not let my personal life be managed by political calculation, then remove me. I will not fight it. The threat he represented was not rebellion, it was indifference. Men in power feared rebels because rebels still cared about the systems they fought against. But a man who genuinely did not care whether he kept his position had no leverage points, nothing to threaten, nothing to manipulate. Thane studied Adrian with new intensity. You are willing to give up your duchy, your family legacy, everything your ancestors built? I am willing to give up a title that requires me to be someone I no longer want to be, Adrian said. My ancestors built an empire on duty without humanity. I am discovering that empires are not worth the cost if you lose yourself maintaining them. You sound like your former wife. The observation was meant as insult. Adrian took it as the highest compliment he had received in months. I should have sounded like her 7 years ago. Maybe then she would not be my former wife. Counselor Brennan laughed, short and bitter. So your solution to personal failure is to abandon the duties you were born to fulfill? How remarkably irresponsible. My solution is to stop pretending that performing duty matters more than becoming a decent human being. You can call that irresponsible. I call it overdue. Thane closed his folder with deliberate precision. Duke Whitemore, I believe we need to speak privately. Council members, please give us the room. The others filed out, some looking confused, others looking satisfied like they had just witnessed a man destroy himself. When the chamber was empty, except for Thane and Adrian, the High Counselor poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter and offered one to Adrian. That was quite a performance, Thane said, settling into the chair next to Adrian rather than maintaining his elevated position. It was not a performance. It was the truth. I believe you. Thane sipped his whiskey thoughtfully, which is why I am going to tell you something in confidence. Half this council wants you removed because you represent a threat to the old systems. Young Duke questioning traditions, implementing progressive reforms, showing vulnerability. It terrifies them because if you can change, they might be expected to change, and change is death to men who have built careers on maintaining the status quo. And the other half of the council want to see if you actually mean what you just said, if you're genuinely willing to walk away from power to maintain your principles. Because that would make you either the stupidest noble we have ever met, or possibly the most dangerous. How is walking away dangerous? Because you would be proving that power only controls people who want it. The moment someone stops caring about keeping their position, they become impossible to manipulate. That is the most subversive force in any hierarchy. Someone with nothing left to lose and principles they will not compromise. Adrian studied Thane, trying to read whether this was manipulation or something resembling honesty. So what happens now? Now you go back to your rooms and I have a very interesting conversation with the council about whether removing you would create more problems than it solves. Come back tomorrow morning. We will have our decision. And if you decide to remove me, then you are free, Thane said, with something that might have been respect. Free from duty. Free from expectation. Free to discover who Adrian Whitemore actually is underneath the title. Some men would kill for that freedom. You stumbled into it by accident through sheer stubborn refusal to keep playing games you no longer believe in. Adrian left the council chamber with his future undecided and his conscience clearer than it had been in years. He returned to his palace rooms and sat at the window watching the city move through its evening rhythms. Somewhere out there, people lived entire lives without ever entering rooms where power was negotiated. They loved and lost and built meaning from things smaller than empires. They were not dukes or counselors or political assets. Just humans trying to survive systems created by people like him. Maybe losing the duchy would be the best thing that ever happened to him. Maybe Serafina had been right. Maybe he needed to discover what was left when the performance ended, even if that was nothing. Even if he spent the rest of his life being nobody in particular instead of Duke of Blackthorn. There was strange comfort in that possibility. Freedom masquerading as failure. A knock at his door interrupted the thought. Adrian opened it to find a palace messenger with an envelope bearing a seal he recognized. Lady Charlotte Dubois. He broke the seal and read with confusion, turning to alarm. Duke Whitemore, you need to return to Northern Territories immediately. Your mother has mobilized support to challenge your authority while you are in the capital. She is claiming you are mentally unfit and gathering council allies to have you declared incompetent. More concerning, she has been visiting Serafina, making threats if she does not publicly testify to your cruelty during your marriage. I do not know what Isolde hopes to gain, but she is willing to destroy anyone in her path to restore her influence. Come quickly. This is worse than political maneuvering. Your mother has become dangerous. Charlotte. Adrian read the letter 3 times while ice spread through his chest. His mother had not accepted banishment. She had been planning retaliation, and now she was threatening Serafina to manufacture evidence for a case Adrian had not known existed. He was being attacked on 2 fronts. The council questioning his judgment in the capital while his mother orchestrated a campaign back home to have him declared unfit. And Serafina was caught in the crossfire because his family could not stop weaponizing her even after she had escaped. Adrian had 2 choices. Stay in the capital for tomorrow's council decision, or return home immediately to stop his mother before she destroyed everyone he cared about. The decision took less than 5 seconds. He threw documents into a saddlebag, left a note for High Counselor Thane explaining the emergency, and was on horseback riding north within 15 minutes. The journey would take 2 days of hard riding, 2 days for his mother to continue whatever destruction she had planned, 2 days for Serafina to face threats she should never have had to endure. Adrian rode through darkness with one clear certainty burning in his mind. He had failed Serafina during their marriage. He would not fail her now. Even if stopping his mother cost him everything else he had, even if the council used his absence as proof of instability, even if he arrived too late to prevent damage that could not be undone. Some battles had to be fought regardless of whether you could win them. Some people had to be protected regardless of whether they wanted your protection. And some moments required you to choose between power and humanity with full knowledge that choosing humanity might destroy everything power had built. Adrian chose, and rode through the night toward a confrontation that would decide not just his future but what kind of man he actually was when every mask had been stripped away. The capital disappeared behind him. Ahead lay his mother's schemes and Serafina's danger and the final reckoning between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. Adrian rode through 2 days of brutal winter, pushing his horse to limits that bordered on cruelty because the alternative was arriving too late. He stopped only when the animal physically could not continue, switching to fresh mounts at posting stations where stable hands looked at him like he was fleeing demons. Perhaps he was. The demons of his own making, finally catching up after years of outrunning consequences. The Northern Territories appeared on the horizon as dusk fell on the 2nd day. Adrian's body ached from sustained riding, but his mind had achieved a clarity that only comes from having nothing left to lose except the people you have already lost. He understood now what Serafina had meant about freedom. When you stop protecting the Empire, you can finally protect what actually matters. He rode straight to the Dubois estate, bypassing Blackthorn Castle entirely. Whatever his mother was planning, Charlotte's letter had made clear that Serafina was the target. Everything else could wait. The estate guards recognized him and opened the gates without question, though one ran ahead to announce his arrival. Adrian dismounted in the courtyard on legs that barely supported his weight. 2 days of riding had left him exhausted and probably looking half mad. He did not care. Appearances had stopped mattering somewhere around the 10th hour in the saddle. Lady Charlotte met him at the door, her expression tight with worry that softened slightly when she saw his condition. "You look terrible," she said without preamble. "Where is she?" "Where is Serafina?" "Inside, unharmed. Your mother has been here twice in the past 3 days making threats, but Serafina has refused to see her." Charlotte stepped aside to let him enter. "She is stronger than your mother expected, stronger than you ever gave her credit for, honestly." "I know." Adrian moved past her into the entrance hall. "I need to see her." "She is in the library." "But Adrian, you should know something first. Your mother has been spreading rumors throughout the territory that you are mentally unstable. She has convinced several minor nobles to sign a petition questioning your competence. And she has told Serafina that if she does not provide testimony about your cruelty during the marriage, She will ensure Serafina never finds peace anywhere in the Northern Territories. What kind of testimony? The kind that would paint you as dangerous, abusive, unfit to hold power. Your mother is building a case to have you removed from the duchy and herself installed as regent until a suitable replacement can be arranged. She is essentially staging a coup using your failed marriage as the weapon. Adrian felt rage burn through exhaustion. His mother had not just betrayed him, she was trying to destroy him using Serafina as ammunition. Again. Still. Always weaponizing the woman Adrian had already heard enough. He found Serafina in the library, sitting by a window with a book closed in her lap. She looked up when he entered, and her expression cycled through surprise, concern, and something that might have been relief before settling on careful neutrality. "You look like you rode through hell to get here," she said quietly. "I did. Charlotte sent word about my mother, about the threats. I am handling it." "You should not have to handle it," Adrian said, moving closer but maintaining distance out of respect for boundaries he had violated too many times before. "My mother is my problem. My family is my responsibility. You should be free of all of this." Serafina set her book aside and stood, studying him with eyes that had learned to read every lie he had ever told himself. "You rode 2 days to tell me that?" "I rode 2 days to stop my mother from hurting you again. To end this permanently." "How?" "By giving her what she actually wants. The duchy. My title. My authority. She can have it all if she leaves you alone." The words hung in the air between them. Serafina's eyes widened slightly, the first genuine surprise he had seen from her in months. "You would give up your entire legacy to protect me?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because you are more important than my legacy. Because I finally understand that power means nothing if you use it to harm the people you should be protecting. Because I failed you during our marriage, but I will not fail you now. Even if you never forgive me, even if this changes nothing between us, I will not let my family destroy you." Serafina moved to the window, looking out at gardens going dormant for winter. When she spoke, her voice was soft with something Adrian could not quite identify. "Your mother came here yesterday. She sat where you are standing now and told me that if I did not testify to your abuse, she would ensure I was barred from every social circle in the Northern Territories, that I would be isolated, alone, unable to build the life I have been trying to create." "What did you say?" "I told her to do her worst, that I had survived 7 years married to her son. Her threats were nothing compared to the loneliness I endured in your castle, that I would rather be isolated by her schemes than ever give her power over me again." Adrian felt something break open in his chest, pride and shame in equal measure. Serafina had faced his mother's cruelty and refused to bend. She had found the strength he had failed to give her when it mattered. "I am sorry," he said, "for everything she put you through, everything I put you through. I cannot fix the past, but I can end this. Today. Permanently." "How?" "By confronting her, publicly, in front of the nobles she has been manipulating, by exposing every lie she told and every scheme she orchestrated, by making it clear that if she ever comes near you again, I will destroy what remains of her reputation so thoroughly that no amount of political maneuvering will restore it." Serafina turned to face him fully. "That will cost you everything. The nobles who support her will turn against you. The council will use it as proof of instability. You will lose your position." "I know, and you are willing to do that? For you, yes." Adrian met her gaze without flinching. "I spent 7 years choosing my position over your well-being. I will not make that mistake again. Even if you never speak to me after today, even if this does not change how you feel about me, you deserve to live without my family's poison following you, and I am the only one who can give you that." Serafina studied him for a long moment, her expression complex with emotions he could not fully read. When she spoke, her voice carried weight he had never heard from her before. "I do not want you to destroy yourself for me, Adrian. I want you to stand up to your mother because it is right. Because she has been manipulating you for years and you finally see it clearly. Do this for yourself, not for me. I am not a prize to be won through grand gestures. I am just a woman trying to live without the weight of your family's dysfunction crushing me." The words were both rejection and liberation. She was right. This could not be about winning her back. It had to be about becoming someone worth being, regardless of whether she ever forgave him. "You are right," Adrian said quietly. "This is not about us. This is about ending the cycle of manipulation and control that has defined my family for generations. My mother has to be stopped, not because of what she is doing to you, but because of what she represents. The belief that power justifies any cruelty. That family legacy matters more than human decency. I have been complicit in that belief my entire life. No more. Serafina nodded slowly. Then I will come with you. You do not have to. I know I do not have to, but I'm tired of being used as a weapon in battles I did not start. If you're going to confront your mother, I want to face her too. To tell her directly that she failed to break me, that all her schemes and threats amounted to nothing except my freedom. There was steel in her voice that Adrian recognized from the woman who had walked out of Blackthorn Castle carrying nothing but determination. Serafina had survived his neglect and his mother's cruelty. Now she was choosing to face both head-on, not from weakness, but from the kind of strength that only comes from having already endured the worst and discovered you can survive it. Together they rode to Blackthorn Castle as night fell. Lady Charlotte accompanied them, along with 2 witnesses she insisted on bringing to document whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Adrian appreciated the strategy. Public accountability was the only thing his mother feared more than losing power. The castle was lit for evening, lamplight glowing in windows that had watched generations of Whitemoors destroy themselves and each other in service of legacy. Adrian dismounted and stood looking at his ancestral home with new eyes. It was beautiful and cold and haunted by decisions that had prioritized stone over soul. He had spent his entire life believing this place was worth any sacrifice. Now he understood it was just a building. Impressive, but ultimately meaningless without people inside it who actually cared about each other. His mother was in this great hall holding court with the nobles she had rallied to her cause. Adrian recognized most of them. Conservative families who feared change. Older generation who believed in the systems that had elevated them, people who saw his progressive reforms as threats rather than progress. Duchess Isolde sat at the head of the table like she had never been banished, like this was her castle, and Adrian was the interloper. She looked up when he entered, and her expression flickered through several emotions before settling on cold satisfaction. Adrian. How fortunate. I was just discussing with our allies the necessity of protecting Blackthorn legacy from leadership that has proven dangerously unstable. Is that what you call manufacturing lies and threatening innocent women? Adrian walked further into the hall, Serafina and Charlotte flanking him while the witnesses positioned themselves near the door. Protection and legacy? I call it doing what is necessary when a duke forgets his duty. The nobles around the table shifted uncomfortably. They had expected Adrian to arrive broken and defensive. Instead, he projected calm certainty that came from having already decided he would sacrifice everything if necessary. Let me be very clear about what has happened here, Adrian said, his voice carrying through the hall. My mother has spent years sabotaging my marriage through systematic lies and manipulation. She intercepted correspondence, fabricated incidents, poisoned my judgment against my wife because Serafina did not fit her vision of what the Duchess should be. When that failed to destroy our marriage quickly enough, she escalated to threatening Serafina directly unless she provided false testimony about abuse that never occurred. All of this in service of removing me from power so she can install herself as regent and eventually arrange a marriage that serves her political goals rather than any human consideration. That is absurd, Isolde said, but her voice lacked conviction. Adrian, you are clearly unwell. Your behavior since the annulment has been erratic. I have documents, Adrian interrupted. Letters my mother wrote to the late Magistrate Thorne detailing her schemes. 6 years of correspondence documenting manipulation and fraud. I have witnesses who will testify to her threats against Lady Serafina. And I have the testimony of my former wife herself, who will tell you exactly what she endured under this roof while my mother orchestrated her isolation. He pulled the packet of letters from his coat and placed them on the table. Several nobles leaned forward to examine them while Isolde's face went white. Those are private correspondence. Those are evidence of crimes committed against my household and my marriage. Adrian's voice was steel wrapped in ice. You manipulated your own son, destroyed an innocent woman's peace, threatened and schemed and lied, all while claiming to act in service of family honor. There is no honor in what you did, mother, only cruelty disguised as duty. Isolde stood, her composure cracking. I did what was necessary. That girl was destroying you. Her name is Serafina, Adrian said quietly. and she never destroyed anything except your illusion of control. You could not tolerate that I might choose my wife over your counsel, that I might build something genuine instead of perpetuating the cold, loveless performance you called marriage. So you sabotaged us from the beginning, ensuring we would fail so you could maintain your influence. Serafina stepped forward, drawing every eye in the room. When she spoke, her voice was clear and carried the weight of 7 years of silenced truth. Duchess Isolde came to my residence 3 days ago and threatened to destroy my reputation throughout the Northern Territories unless I provided false testimony that your son was abusive and unstable during our marriage. She told me that no amount of distance would protect me from her reach, that she would ensure I was isolated and miserable anywhere I tried to build a new life. The nobles murmured. This was worse than political maneuvering. This was a dowager duchess threatening a woman who had already left the family. It suggested vindictiveness that had nothing to do with protecting family interests. I refused her threats, Serafina continued, not because I have any interest in protecting Adrian from consequences of his own failures, but because I will not be used as a weapon in power struggles I want no part of. My marriage to your duke ended because he was emotionally distant and incapable of partnership, not because he was abusive. If you want to remove him from power, do it honestly, based on his actual failures rather than manufactured lies. The distinction mattered. Serafina was not defending Adrian. She was defending truth. The nobles understood the difference. Isolde looked around the table and seemed to realize her support was crumbling. The carefully cultivated alliance of conservatives who feared change was encountering something they feared more. A woman willing to lie and threaten innocent people to maintain control. That suggested instability far more dangerous than Adrian's recent reforms. This is a conspiracy, Isolde said, her voice rising with desperation. They are working together to discredit me. We barely speak, Mother. Serafina wants nothing to do with me. We are not conspiring. We are simply telling the truth that you have spent years obscuring. Adrian turned to address the nobles directly. I am not asking you to support me. I am not campaigning to keep my position. If you believe I am unfit to lead, then remove me. But do it based on my actual decisions and policies, not on lies my mother manufactured to restore her own power. And understand that if you side with her after seeing this evidence, you are enabling someone who believes manipulation and threats are acceptable tools for maintaining control. That sets a precedent that will come back to haunt all of you eventually. The room fell silent. Adrian could see calculations happening behind carefully neutral expressions. Political allegiances being reassessed, risk being weighed against principle. This was how power actually functioned, not through grand speeches or noble ideals, but through cold evaluation of who posed the greater threat. Lord Ashford stood slowly. He was the most influential noble present, and his position would determine which way the others fell. Duke Whitemore, I have reviewed the letters. The handwriting is clearly Duchess Isolde's. The magistrate's seal is authentic. These documents are legitimate evidence of sustained manipulation. He turned to Isolde with something like pity in his expression. Dowager Duchess, I believe it is in everyone's best interest if you retire to your city residence permanently and withdraw from all duchy affairs immediately. Your presence has become more liability than asset. Other nobles nodded agreement. Isolde looked around the table at allies who were abandoning her with the same cold calculation she had employed throughout her life. This was what happened when manipulation was exposed. The power it provided evaporated instantly because it had always been built on illusion rather than genuine respect or loyalty. You are all fools, Isolde said, her voice shaking with rage and something that might have been fear. Adrian is weak. He prioritizes sentiment over strength. He will destroy everything this family built. This family built nothing worth keeping if it required destroying innocent people to maintain it, Adrian said quietly. You taught me that power without humanity is just cruelty with better architecture. I am done perpetuating that legacy. If it costs me the duchy, so be it. Isolde stared at her son with an expression that cycled through emotions too quickly to name. For a moment, Adrian thought she might apologize, might recognize the damage she had caused. But the moment passed and her face hardened into the mask of righteous indignation that had served her for decades. You will regret this, she said. No, Adrian replied. I regret listening to you for as long as I did. This is the first decision I have made that I am certain is right. Guards escorted Duchess Isolde from the hall. She went with rigid dignity, maintaining composure even as her influence dissolved around her. Adrian watched his mother leave and felt only exhaustion. No victory, no satisfaction, just the hollow relief of ending something that should have ended years ago. The nobles dispersed with promises to send formal statements supporting Adrian's continued leadership. Lord Ashford approached him privately, his expression thoughtful. "That took considerable courage," he said quietly. "Publicly confronting your own mother. Most men would have handled this more quietly." "Quiet handling is what allowed her to operate for so long," Adrian said. "This had to be public so everyone understood the full extent of what she did, so Serafina could have witnesses to the truth instead of living under the shadow of lies." Ashford nodded. "For what it is worth, I believe you are becoming a better leader than your father was. He ruled through fear and control. You are learning to rule through integrity. The transition is painful but necessary. I may not rule at all if the Capital Council decides I am unfit. Then you will have proven something more valuable than fitness to rule, that you are willing to lose power to maintain principles. That is the kind of leader people actually respect, even if the council does not understand it yet." After the nobles left, Adrian found Serafina in the castle courtyard preparing to return to the Dubois estate. She stood beside her horse, looking up at Blackthorn Castle with an expression he could not quite read. "Thank you," Adrian said, approaching carefully, "for coming, for testifying. You did not have to do that." "I know." Serafina turned to face him. "I did it because your mother needed to understand that threatening me would not work, that I am not the same woman who left this castle months ago. I am stronger now, strong enough to face the people who hurt me and tell them they failed to break me. You were always strong. I was just too blind to see it. No. I became strong after I left you. There is a difference." She pulled on her riding gloves with careful precision. "During our marriage, I was surviving. Now I am living. Your mother's threats were pathetic compared to 7 years of emotional neglect. She could not hurt me because you already did the worst damage possible, and I survived it." The words were not cruel, just honest. Adrian absorbed them like deserved punishment. "What will you do now?" Serafina asked. "With the duchy, with your life?" "I do not know. The council may still remove me. My reforms have made enemies. My mother's supporters may regroup, but for the first time I am making decisions based on what I believe is right rather than what maintains power. That is new territory." "How does it feel?" "Terrifying, liberating, necessary." Adrian managed a tired smile. "You were right about everything. I built my entire identity around a title I never chose, performed a role I never questioned, lost the only person who mattered because I could not see beyond the performance. Now I am trying to figure out who I actually am without the script. And who is that? I have no idea. But I think that is the point. Discovery instead of inheritance, choice instead of obligation." Serafina looked at him with something that might have been approval. "That sounds like growth. Does growth earn forgiveness?" "No," she said simply. "Growth is its own reward. Forgiveness is separate, unrelated. Something I may or may not give you someday depending on whether I want to, not whether you have earned it." The honesty was brutal and exactly what Adrian needed to hear. Forgiveness was not a transaction, not something he could win through sufficient suffering or change. It was a gift Serafina might offer if and when she decided he deserved it. Until then, he had to live with the consequences of his failures regardless of how much he had grown. "I understand," Adrian said. "Thank you for being honest. I was always honest with you, Adrian. You just were not listening." She mounted her horse with practiced ease. Lady Charlotte joined her, and together they rode toward the castle gates. Adrian watched them go and felt the strange peace that comes from accepting you cannot control how others respond to your transformation. He had confronted his mother, exposed the lies, protected Serafina as much as she would allow. The rest was beyond his authority to command or influence. He returned to his study and found a letter from High Counselor Thane had arrived during the confrontation. He opened it with hands that were steadier than expected. "Duke Whitemore, your absence from the capital proceedings was noted with interest. Your secretary provided explanation regarding family emergency. After considerable debate, the council has decided to allow you to retain your position on a probationary basis. Your reforms will be monitored. Your stability will be assessed regularly. But several council members were impressed by your willingness to prioritize family crisis over political performance. It suggested priorities we find refreshing compared to the usual calculating, ambitious nobility we encounter. Do not make us regret this decision. High Counselor Marcus Thane. Adrian read the letter twice, then set it aside with something that felt almost like amusement. He had kept his position by abandoning the proceedings that would determine whether he kept his position. The absurdity was not lost on him. Apparently, authenticity was so rare among nobility that even inappropriate authenticity carried its own kind of power. He spent the following weeks rebuilding structures his mother had corrupted. He formally apologized to families she had manipulated. He implemented oversight to prevent future dowager duchesses from accumulating unchecked influence. He continued the reforms Serafina had advocated for years ago, not to honor her memory, but because they were objectively correct policies he had been too stubborn to recognize. The castle felt different without his mother's presence. Lighter somehow, as if decades of calculation and control had been exercised, leaving space for something more genuine to potentially grow. Adrian did not know if he could build that something alone, did not know if he even wanted to continue living in a castle that held so many memories of failures. But he continued anyway because that was what growth required, showing up, trying, choosing better even when better was uncomfortable and uncertain. 3 months after the confrontation, Adrian received an invitation that surprised him. Lady Charlotte was hosting a spring garden party at her country estate. The invitation explicitly stated that Serafina would be present and had been informed of his invitation. If he chose to attend, it would be the first time they had seen each other since that night in the courtyard. Adrian spent 2 days deciding whether to go. Part of him wanted to see her, to learn how she was thriving without him, to maybe show her that he continued to change in ways she might recognize. But another part understood that his growth could not be about winning her approval. It had to be for himself, or it meant nothing. He decided to attend, not to impress Serafina, but because isolation was the old Adrian's solution to discomfort. The new Adrian was trying to engage with life, even when it was awkward and potentially painful. The garden party was exactly what the name suggested. 50 guests scattered across manicured lawns, conversation and laughter floating through spring air that smelled of flowers and renewal. Adrian arrived alone, without the usual entourage dukes typically traveled with. Several people noticed and whispered. Let them whisper. He found Serafina near the fountain talking with Lady Pemberton about the Orphanage Reform Committee's latest successes. She wore pale green that complemented the garden setting. Her hair was loose, and she was laughing at something Pemberton had said. The sound of her genuine laughter hit Adrian like a physical thing. This was who she had always been underneath the weight of being his Duchess, warm and engaged and fully alive. She noticed him watching, and her expression shifted to something carefully neutral. She excused herself from Pemberton and walked toward him with measured steps. They met halfway across the lawn, equal distance traveled by both. The symbolism was probably unintentional, but Adrian noted it anyway. Duke Whitemore, Serafina said formally. Lady Serafina. Adrian bowed slightly, respecting the distance she maintained. Thank you for allowing Charlotte to invite me. I did not allow or disallow it. This is Charlotte's event. She invites who she chooses. Of course. I just wanted you to know I would not have come if you had objected. Why would I object? You are a duke attending a social function. Perfectly appropriate. The formality was armor, and Adrian understood why she needed it. He had destroyed her ability to trust his presence without careful boundaries. That damage could not be undone through 3 months of reform and good behavior. How have you been? He asked, genuinely wanting to know. Good. Busy. The committee has expanded to 3 neighboring territories. We are establishing standards for orphan care across the region. It is meaningful work. I have been implementing your recommendations from years ago, the policies you advocated for that I dismissed. They are working exactly as you predicted they would. I know. I have heard reports. Serafina's expression softened slightly. It is good that you are finally listening to people who understand these issues better than you do. You understood them better than I did. I should have listened years ago. Yes, you should have. The honesty was sharp, but not cruel. Adrian accepted it as deserved. They stood in awkward silence while the party continued around them. Other guests watched with poorly concealed interest. The former Duke and Duchess, in their first public interaction since the annulment, Everyone wanted to know if there would be drama or reconciliation or something quotable to spread through social circles. Adrian decided to give them nothing except truth. "I'm not here to ask you to reconsider the annulment," he said quietly. "I am not going to make grand declarations or beg for another chance. I am here because Charlotte invited me, and I am trying to rejoin society in ways that do not involve hiding in my castle. But I want you to know that everything I have done in the past 3 months has been about becoming someone worth being, regardless of whether you ever forgive me. Your approval is not my motivation. Growth itself is the goal." Serafina studied him with eyes that had learned to detect lies through years of marriage to a man who had lied mostly to himself. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her because her expression shifted again, this time toward something that might have been respect. "I believe you," she said. "I think you have genuinely changed in ways that matter. And I am glad for you, Adrian, truly. You deserve to become someone you can live with. Do you think you will ever forgive me? I do not know. Maybe. Eventually. Or maybe not. Forgiveness is not something I can predict or promise. It is not something you can earn through sufficient good behavior. It will happen if and when my heart decides it is ready. Until then, we are simply two people who used to be married, trying to exist in the same social circles without causing each other pain. That is fair. Is it? Most men would find it frustrating, not having a clear path to redemption. Redemption implies I deserve salvation. I am not certain I do. I am just trying to be better than I was. If that eventually leads to your forgiveness, I will be grateful. If it does not, I will understand why." Serafina smiled slightly. "That is exactly the right answer. The fact that you gave it without trying to manipulate me into feeling guilty suggests you might actually mean it. I do mean it. Then we can be civil, polite, maybe eventually something approaching friendly. But do not expect more than that, Adrian. I have built a life I love without you in it. I am not interested in disrupting that life for the possibility that you might finally be capable of partnership. I understand, and for what it is worth, I am proud of you. For leaving. For building something meaningful, for refusing to let my family's toxicity define your future. You are everything I should have recognized you were 7 years ago." "Thank you," Serafina said softly. "That actually means something." They parted ways naturally, returning to separate conversations with separate groups of people. Adrian spent the rest of the party talking with nobles about policy and reform. He did not watch Serafina constantly, did not engineer opportunities to speak with her again. Just existed in the same space without making her presence about him. It was progress, small and insufficient, but real. As the party wound down and guests began departing, Lady Charlotte found Adrian near the garden gate. "That went well," she said. "No drama, no uncomfortable scenes, just two adults being civil. Is that your version of a compliment?" "It is my version of acknowledging that you have changed more than I expected. 3 months ago, I would not have invited you to an event where Serafina would be present. Too much risk of you creating problems. Today you proved you can share space with her without making it about your regrets or her forgiveness. That is growth. I'm trying. I know." Charlotte's expression softened. "For what it is worth, I think Serafina sees it too. She may never take you back. Probably will not, honestly. But she does not hate you anymore. She has moved beyond hate into indifference with occasional moments of respect. That is as much as you can hope for. It is more than I deserve." "Yes, it is. Do not waste it by hoping for more." Adrian returned to Blackthorn Castle as twilight fell. The ride was peaceful in ways that surprised him. He was not desperately analyzing every word Serafina had said, not searching for hidden meanings or possibilities of reconciliation, just accepting that she was thriving without him and he was learning to thrive without her approval. This was what actual growth felt like. Not performance, not calculation, just the slow, unglamorous work of becoming better. Because being better mattered more than the rewards it might bring. Over the following months, Adrian continued transforming the duchy into something more humane. He attended social functions where Serafina was present, and they maintained careful civility that gradually softened into something approaching genuine friendliness. He stopped hoping she would forgive him and started appreciating that she no longer flinched when he entered rooms. 1 year after their annulment, Adrian received an invitation to Serafina's estate. Not the Dubois property where she had been staying, but land she had purchased herself with her settlement funds. She was hosting a celebration for the Orphanage Reform Committee's first anniversary and wanted him to attend as a guest, not as the Duke who had funded the reforms, but as someone who had contributed to making them possible. Adrian arrived to find a modest estate that reflected everything Serafina had always valued. Warm and welcoming without being ostentatious. Gardens designed for beauty rather than status display. Rooms that felt lived in rather than maintained as showpieces. Serafina greeted him at the door with a smile that reached her eyes. She wore simple blue and her hair was braided with flowers from her garden. She looked happy in ways that had nothing to do with him, and Adrian felt genuine joy at seeing it. "Welcome," she said. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. Your home is beautiful. It is mine. That makes it beautiful regardless of what it looks like." They walked through the party together, discussing committee work and duchy reforms. The conversation was easy in ways their marriage talks had never been. No tension, no unspoken expectations, just two people who had survived destroying each other and learned how to exist in each other's presence without causing further damage. Near the end of the evening, they found themselves alone on the terrace overlooking gardens going gold with sunset. "I have been thinking," Serafina said, "about forgiveness." Adrian's breath caught, but he forced himself to stay calm. Whatever she decided, he would accept it. "I do not know if I will ever forgive you completely for the 7 years of loneliness, for making me feel invisible in my own marriage, for choosing your empire over my humanity. Those wounds are deep and they shaped who I became, but I think I have forgiven you for being young and broken and following terrible examples from terrible people, for not knowing better until it was too late, for the specific kind of ignorance that comes from privilege and isolation. That is more forgiveness than I expected." "It is not reconciliation," Serafina said firmly. "I am not interested in resuming any kind of romantic relationship. But I think we can be friends, real friends, people who care about each other's well-being without needing to possess each other. Is that something you would want?" "Yes," Adrian said quietly. "That is exactly what I would want." "Then we are friends," Serafina said, holding out her hand. Adrian took it and they shook like business partners sealing an agreement. It was not a kiss, not an embrace, not anything resembling romance. Just two people who had once been married deciding they could be something healthier instead. And somehow, standing on that terrace watching sunset paint the world in gold, Adrian felt more peace than he had experienced in years. He had not won Serafina back, had not earned redemption or second chances. But he had earned something more valuable, the possibility of friendship built on mutual respect instead of obligation. That night, Adrian returned to Blackthorn Castle and sat in his study looking at papers that no longer felt like they defined his worth. He was still Duke of Blackthorn, still managing territories and implementing reforms, but the title no longer consumed his identity. It was something he did, not something he was. He pulled out paper and began writing. Not a letter this time, just thoughts about legacy and what it actually meant to leave something behind that mattered. His father had left an empire maintained through control and fear. His mother had left a reputation destroyed by her own schemes. What would Adrian leave? What could he build in the years remaining that would actually matter once he was gone? The answer came with surprising clarity. Not buildings or territories or political influence, but the changes he had implemented that improved actual lives. The orphans who would have better futures because of reforms he had funded. The women who would have educational opportunities because of programs he had supported. The people who would benefit from systems he had restructured to be more just. Legacy was not about being remembered. It was about the world continuing slightly better because you had existed. That was the only monument worth building. Adrian set down his pen and looked out his study window at grounds covered in spring flowers. Somewhere beyond these walls, Serafina was building a life that had nothing to do with him. She was happy, free, exactly what he had wanted for her once he had finally learned how to want anything beyond his own power. He had lost his wife, kept his duchy, gained something resembling wisdom. The arithmetic of that equation would never balance, but Adrian was learning to accept that some losses cannot be recovered no matter how much you change. Some damage is permanent. Some relationships end and stay ended regardless of growth or regret. The trick was learning to live with that truth without letting it consume you, to accept responsibility without drowning in shame, to To keep growing even when growth brought no rewards except the quiet satisfaction of becoming someone you could stand being. Adrian had spent 7 years being a terrible husband. He would spend however many years remained being a better man. Not to win anyone back, not to earn forgiveness he might never receive. Just because being better was its own purpose and its own reward. Outside his window, spring continued its work of renewal. Inside his castle, a duke who had learned too late what actually mattered sat alone with the consequences of his choices. And somewhere in the space between regret and acceptance, Adrian Whitemore finally found something resembling peace. The story of Duke Adrian Whitemore and Lady Seraphina Vale did not end with possession or reconciliation or romantic reunion. It ended with two people who had nearly destroyed each other learning how to exist in the same world without causing further harm. Learning that love without respect is just control wearing a softer mask. That some endings are necessary even when they hurt. That growth sometimes means accepting you cannot fix what you broke, only commit to breaking nothing else. Seraphina found her freedom. Adrian found his humanity. And between them, the space where their marriage had been collapsed into something healthier than what they had tried to force. Not love, not hatred. Just two people who had learned the hardest lesson life can teach. That sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is let someone go and hope they find happiness you could never give them. Some stories are not meant to end with possession, but with letting go. And under the same winter sky where a duke once knelt in despair, two souls who had been broken by each other finally learned how to be whole again. Separately. Peacefully. Free.